Vale kept his eyes open as he hid under the pile of discarded clothing, using a small gap to see out of his hiding spot. The smell of salty seawater that accompanied the fog slowly faded away, as did the fog itself, which seemed to reverse out of the building that he was hiding in as though he was watching a movie in reverse. The way it billowed in through the windows and the crack in the door was unnatural, but what was even more unnatural was how it exited, flowing out those same entrances as if it was a living thing. As a result, Vale was very much of the mind to keep hiding in the pile of clothing. He just needed to wait a fair bit longer, as his arm and clothing were nearly restored. The whole process of regrowing an entire arm felt utterly grotesque to him. He could literally feel his stump bubbling and distorting, and the nerves that were growing were sending out all manner of signals. What put the most butterflies in his stomach out of all of it was the sensations born from the fact that his fingers and thumb were starting off as little nubbles with barely any bone or other tissues, but they were gradually extending and morphing into functional digits. It took another few unnerving seconds for the last of the damages to his body and attire to be undone, and in Vale's mind, the fact that he was now complete once again could not have been more welcome. As he lay beneath the pile, he remembered that there was an easy way to check if his surroundings were safe. In fact, he felt like an idiot for forgetting about the minimap in all of his haste to follow his gut. He pulled up the minimap and, lo and behold, the surroundings had no dots indicating hostiles. This was, well, a broken bar. Strange. He had expected that the people who had come in after he had ducked away to safety were hostile, and that, by extension, the rest of this place would be hostile as well. This did not seem to be the case, as all of the dots on his minimap showed not only no hostility, but they showed that they were allies. Given that his gut had never steered him wrong before, he assumed that there was some sort of trick going on. But now that his body and outfit were back at 100%, he was more willing to try and roll the dice. Emerging from his hiding spot, Vale walked over to the door he had entered the building through and cracked it open by about a half-inch. His mask was a lifesaver on more than one occasion, and now it earned its place in his outfit once again by letting him see much farther via a zoom function. The outside was not nearly as empty as it had been just a few minutes prior. No. Now it was practically filled with people, a decent number of which somehow did not appear on his minimap at all. That was a broken bar bizarre. But then again, the minimap didn't show all the random NPCs in a town simply due to the massive processing power needed to tell everyone exactly where each NPC was and what they were doing. Vale assumed that this was why the number of dots was less than half of the number of people he was seeing. Then again, that might not be the case in this new world. But to be brutally honest, he had not really checked how the minimap handled things like that in the few times that he had been around large numbers of non-hostile people. In hindsight, he probably should have done a few more experiments back in the former Republic of Theon, but it was too late for that now. As the crowd of people went about their business, Vale decided to bite the bullet and exited the building, taking his chances that nothing would end up happening. And, thankfully enough, nothing did. He did notice that more than a few people seemed to focus their gaze on him for an unnervingly long period of time before going back to their business, but Vale wanted to chalk that up to his clothes. After all, everyone around was wearing normal civilian stuff and he was wearing clothes that not even a king could afford. By that logic, of course he would stand out like a sore thumb. However, the feeling of vague unease still was assaulting him constantly. It wasn't nearly as bad nor as potent as it had been moments after he got here, but it was still there, always in the back of his mind and constantly nagging him. He wasn't sure what was causing this vague feeling of discomfort, but he wasn't about to stick around and find out. To avoid causing too much damage and to avoid earning the ire of the people in this place, Vale leapt up onto the rooftops and the broken bar. Well, he tried to leap up to the rooftops, but instead, he only jumped about as high as he could back when he wasn't playing a video game. He, at most, got just under a yard above ground before gravity took hold over him and brought him back down to the ground. He tried again, but again he only got a few feet off of the sidewalk before he came down as though he was not in a fantasy world. Curious about this, he popped open the menu and did a quick check of his stats. Sure enough, nothing in his stat block had changed at all. He was still just as overpowered as he had been the day that he found himself in the new world, which made him wonder why he was unable to exert his body's full capabilities. He tried to do a few more checks to see how much of his power was being nerfed and discovered that he essentially had the same basic capabilities as a normal human from outside any games. Somehow, right now he was normal, just as normal as he had been when he plugged into the VR games that he played. Vale took a look around him and checked his minimap. He was surrounded by people who showed up as allies and many more people who didn't show up on the minimap at all, and since his physical abilities seemed to be restricted, he decided to roll the dice one more time. He reached up and pulled down the hood that kept his hair from being seen. This seemingly had no effect on anyone, and so he took off his mask and let the full power of his reversed attractiveness be exposed to everyone around him. He fully expected everyone to turn hostile, and if not that, then he expected them to lose their lunches. This did not happen, and instead of either of those things, the people around paid him no mind and simply went about their daily business. And that, more than anything else, sent up massive red flags in Vale's mind. He could understand some force or power in the new world limiting his physical prowess, but to cancel out his reversed attractiveness? He now knew that something fishy was going on. He knew he was still in the new world, but for all of his abilities and attributes, including his most potent one, to be like this? Something had to be going on in this place, and he wanted no part in it. It was time to make like a smart person in a horror movie and get the fuck out. Vale's sinking feeling was only growing. He had walked through the streets of this city, taking full advantage of the fact that he was somehow a normal person once again, albeit a bit taller than he was outside of the game and before he got sent to this new world, but he still had a sense of unease following him closely. He tried to enjoy the fact that he didn't need to wear his usual outfit and his mask, but he just kept getting this feeling that he was being watched. To his credit, he did look around as much as possible without trying to look like he was onto whomever or whatever was keeping a secret eye on him. But when you have that kind of growing paranoia, you start to look fidgety and afraid no matter what you do. At this point, although he was enjoying the fresh coastal air on his exposed skin, he had developed an unconscious tic. He just couldn't help himself from looking around, and while he tried to keep a decent expression, he also couldn't help that his face was beginning to show his growing anxiety. Nothing about this place seemed to be anormal despite most of it being anormal. Aside from the omnipresent sensation of being both followed and watched, the fact that there was a fog bank locked at a position just a little bit above the rooftops of all the buildings he had come across just was not right. He could tell that something about this city just was wrong, but he just could not put his finger on what it was. Due to these factors, he had long since decided to get the heck out of Dodge. Unfortunately, he was having a very, very difficult time doing that. He had followed the street that he was on for what he was positive was over 30 miles, and yet he was also sure that he had passed the exact same stores and stalls at least once before. As if that wasn't enough to unnerve him, those stalls and shops had the exact same people in them, with the exact same faces, clothing, and other such things as they had the previous time that he had passed them. And, to make matters even more concerning, the street he had been walking down was a single straight line. This street had been perfectly straight, never turning or twisting even once, so it was therefore impossible for him to have gone around in a circle. As he passed the same person that he had seen prior to this at least twice before, he decided that if that street couldn't get him out of here, then he would use another. Thankfully, there was an intersection up ahead, so once he reached it he took a turn and went down that street instead. Another few hours of walking and running saw him in the same damn predicament as he had been before, as he reached that same intersection that he had used just a while prior. Now, more than ever, he was feeling discomfort and unease. He had no idea where this city's limits were, and seeing as he was unable to go anywhere new without eventually somehow looping back to his starting position, he chose to call it a day. However, as he now had a concrete feeling that he was being observed, he chose to use an inn that was on the biggest road. He opened the door, which creaked like it was straight from an old movie filled with every cliche copyright imaginable, and entered the building. There were people inside already, some of whom appeared on his minimap, and most of them, those on his minimap and not, were busy doing typical fantasy tavern/inn things. There were a few card and dice games going on, more than a few servers walking about the place, and he saw that there was a shadowy figure in the corner, as per tradition. However, he didn't care if that figure was some random plot hook, and he refused to acknowledge them after he initially spotted them. If there was some power at play here, then he was for damn sure not going to go along with such obvious railroading and inane clichés. As such, he did the second most cliché-copyright thing you could do in a situation like this and merely asked to rent a room for the night. He still had at least a few trillion gold in his wallet from the game, and he had long since learned that the money from the MMO was just as valid as the new forms of currency. Hell, in some cases it was even more valuable than regular money, simply because of its rarity. Wouldn't those collectors be pissed if he flooded the market with all of his savings? Well, it didn't matter right now. All he needed to do was rent a room and prepare for the night. Oh, don't worry about payment, sweetie. Excuse me? Vale asked. He had not expected that. But then again, he was expecting to have not expected something, so it didn't count. You just tuck in and have a good night's rest, alright? Dinner starts in 5 minutes, so if you want, we can serve you in a bit. I'm sure that you're hungry, and don't worry, it's on the house. Vale merely took the key and went upstairs. It was a broken bar, unusual how people were treating him, and he could not simply explain it by the logic that he was new in town and everyone wanted to be nice to a visitor. No, he couldn't quite express why he felt this way, but he had the distinct impression that he was not going to be any safer in the room he had gotten for free than if he was out on the streets. Likewise, he just had a gut feeling that she shouldn't eat anything that was served here, let alone drink anything either. Well, if his gut was as correct as it had been so far, he would make sure that he made a Lord Adornable proud, and decided that it was in his best interest to fortify the absolute shit out of his room. Screw putting a chair to the door, he would bust out everything he could feasibly get away with, if only to make sure that both the door and the windows were utterly impenetrable. As he sequestered himself in that room, he swore he caught the sight of some weird-ass dog-looking thing inside before him. However, before he could take a good look, the creature, if there ever was one that to begin with, vanished as if pulled into the space between one of the legs of the room's table and the floor. He checked around to make sure he was not going crazy, but found nothing, not even a single paw print. He wasn't going to pull a move similar to a Bethesda NPC and just act like nothing had happened, but he couldn't find any evidence that the dog-like thing was there either. And so, with growing anxiety and the creeping feeling that there was at least one weird, teleporting dog-like thing nearby, Vale set to work turning the room he had booked into a fortress. It would take a bit of time, but he figured that, by nightfall, he would have everything in place. Thankfully, the windows were able to be closed, locked from the inside, and were at least 20 feet off of the ground. If he with his busted stats couldn't jump that high, then nobody else could either. Still, he wouldn't make a Lord Adornable proud unless he made those things impossible to get through, so that was more work added to the pile. The fog over the top of the city, or what little of it he was able to explore without the loop kicking in, had darkened considerably, and even though he had covered the window in a layer or anti-shatter coating, enchanted metal bars and Yggdrasil wood boards, in that exact order, he could still see a little bit outside. The darkening skies led to darkening streets, which were slowly illuminated against the growing night by street lamps that went from emitting a dull glow to broken bar a slightly less dull glow. But that wasn't all that added to the creep factor. As darkness descended, so too did the fog that was over everything, slinking down in what seemed to be purposefully moving tendrils that wrapped around the street lamps, lowering the illumination they provided to a level that would see even the most stubborn of maintenance workers decide that it wasn't worth the potential lawsuit and slash or sure fine to let the light be that low. For those of you readers who don't get that reference, then basically the fog was making the ambient lighting low enough that it would almost certainly lead to lawsuits and government safety regulation fines. If your country's government doesn't have that power, then you probably live in a place with sweatshops, as it had done when he had first arrived in this weird city. The fog tried to worm its way into the area around him. The vapor seemingly had a will of its own, and Vale had prepared for it. The windows were protected in the way stated above. The door was blocked by no fewer than 5 different barriers, as well as a few holy icons that he had picked up over the course of his playtime, things like crosses, stars of David, etc., because while he wasn't sure if they had any power, he was going to use anything and everything in his arsenal. And, if all of that wasn't enough, the walls were plastered with wards, runes, enchanted and blessed pictures, and posters, and the base of all of that was ringed internally by a metric fuckton of various relics and statues. Hell, he had even busted out a few old tomes that he had just collecting dust in his item box and drawn some rather gnarly occult symbols all over the floor and the walls. Not in his own blood, of course. He wasn't interested in accidentally empowering whatever spooky bullshit was going on in this place, so using blood, excrement, or anything else that one might use in such rituals was right out. And, as he held his breath and waited for something to inevitably go horrifically wrong, he was pleasantly surprised when the living tendrils of fog seemed to be actually quite peeved that they couldn't get into the room. Inside of him, there was a hell of a battle going on as part of him wanted to get up and mock the fog and another screamed at that first part that doing so was one of the dumbest things someone can do in a situation like this. Eventually, the latter part of him won out, and Vale continued to sit inside the middle of the room on top of a spell circle while covered head to toe in his full outfit, mask included. He said nothing, he barely even moved, and he tried desperately to pay absolutely no mind to the fact that it sounded like every counter-terrorism unit from every nation on Earth was trying to smash down the door all at once. In the beginning, the knocking on the door had been rather nice and soft. The appeals from the barmaid that he had gotten the key to his room from quickly began to turn rather dark, and the knocking on the door turned to banging and then finally to a sound akin to someone trying to perform river dance but with jackhammers instead of shoes and on a door rather than a stage. And, as if the sound of what was trying to pass off as a sustained aerial carpet bombing raid by tens of thousands of bombers wasn't bad enough, the barmaid's appeals had shifted as well. Gone were the calm and collected and downright cheerful requests to come down for some fun or the questions about his well-being. After those failed to get a response and after the fog began to get rather annoyed with its inability to enter his room, the barmaid's tone took a turn for the worse. After the charm didn't work, next came some rather crass language, which was followed shortly thereafter by a mix of incoherent, banshee-like screeching and absurdly creative cursing that would make both a Karen and sailor look like rank amateurs by comparison. Despite all of that happening, Vale stayed seated in the dead center of a roughly 2-meter-wide circle around him. He said nothing for the entirety of that time, silently and internally screaming about how he would probably have just gotten up and smashed his way to safety by now if he still could use his busted as fuck stats. He was nearly pissing himself scared, if for no other reason than because, for the first time in a very, very long time, he was stuck as a nobody with no real power in a situation where he was quite possibly going to die without it. And by it I mean his broken as fuck endgame MMO player stats and such, of course. And so, for what felt to him like a solid 5 days but was actually just a mere 2 hours, he sat in silence as a growing number of people screamed and cussed him out for not opening the door while actively trying to break it down. Under his mask, his face was locked in a smile even though his eyes were showing his true feelings, which boiled down to a message of please, dear God, fucking end this fucking nightmare right the fuck now. Well, at least the crazy people outside hadn't had the bright idea to set everything on fire to smoke him out. And, after 2 hours had passed and the fog and the people outside stopped trying to get in, the stress and general exhaustion finally caught up with our hero and he found himself passing out in a seated position. Thankfully, he would not need to worry about anything else for the rest of the night and could finally get some well-deserved rest. No, seriously, he could. And he did. What? Did you really think I wouldn't throw the poor man a bone? Geez, I may be cruel to the people in my novels, but I'm not that evil. Well, maybe I am, but not right now. Not yet. Unaware our broken bar. Vale's eyes snapped open, and he jolted awake where he sat. He fully expected that the barriers that he had put in place would have been broken down by now, but thankfully that wasn't the case. Instead, the people that had been banging on the door for what, to him, felt like an eternity had either gotten tired of it or had found something more productive to do. There were no further impacts on the door, and the mysterious fog had ascended back into the place it had been during the day. The defenses had worked better than he had anticipated, and, for the first time since he got here, he didn't feel the unnerving and omnipresent gaze of someone or something watching him. Well, that wasn't entirely true, as the moment he had finished setting up the numerous defenses just before the previous night started, he felt a weight lift off of him. He wasn't fully aware of it then, but now he could tell that what that weight had been was the eerie sensation of some enigmatic force observing him. Now it was brighter outside, or at least it appeared to be so through the minor gaps in the mix of metal bars and wooden boards that he had used to help keep the window secure. A quick peek through the gaps let Vale know that he had likely slept for far longer than he anticipated, as there was a decent amount of light outside and there were people milling about doing their mundane activities. Vale came to the conclusion that he was safe here, but he wouldn't be able to stay here forever if he ever wanted to leave this spooky place. Despite the safety the barriers provided and the fact that his item box was filled with enough time frozen food to last him several normal human lifetimes, Vale didn't exactly wish to be a hikikomori. Aside from the light outside as well as the people doing their thing, the lack of people attempting to enter his room gave Vale an idea. If he could just get back to this room before darkness fell and the people of this city went crazy, he would gradually be able to explore this city and see just how much he could access before the loop kicked in. Maybe, like that very, very old Sans edutainment game about a man in green whose brother went missing, there were secret and not so secret ways to avoid the endlessly looping streets. Mind you, he would prefer not to use that game's mode of transit, as he found the idea of traveling through massive sewer pipes to be disgusting. But if it was either that or remain stuck in this creepy place forever, he would gladly take a trip through the sewers. Of course, if he found any angry turtle or mushroom people down there, then he would know for certain that things were weirder than he ever could have imagined. Mustering up the courage that he needed, Vale opened the door to his room and peeked outside. There was nobody there and all seemed to be back to the status quo from before that madness last night. Vale took his first steps outside and shut the door behind him, trusting that the barriers would prevent anyone and anything from entering without his express permission. He nearly had walked down the hall towards the stairs down to the main floor when he had the urge to check the state of the hall side of the door to his room. The fine wood was perfectly undamaged, almost as if it had only been made and varnished just a few moments prior. However, as soon as he finished checking the state of the door and went to continue his exploration, the sensation of some unseen observer monitoring him came back and caused the hairs on the back of his neck to stand up. Now he was absolutely certain beyond any reasonable doubt that he wasn't merely being paranoid when he felt this way yesterday. Unconsciously, he took a cursory glance over his shoulder and, once again, swore that he saw some kind of weird, alien dog thing behind him for only the briefest of moments. He took this chance to spin around to get a full look, but the dog thing was gone before he could see it entirely. This was the final nail in the coffin in regard to Vale's original belief that he was going crazy. He knew what he saw, and he knew what he felt. He had played enough VR horror games to know this feeling, and now he was dead certain that he had likely found himself in some place where the rules of horror movies applied. He would make damn fucking sure that anyone who tried to hold him up until after dark would be unable to keep him out late. He wasn't a master of horror, but he understood all too well that in such situations that common sense and caution were, more often than not, your best friend, if not your savior. Despite knowing he was safer in that room, he needed to find a way out of this place if he ever hoped to last for very long. After all, in most horror scenarios, the hauntings, and other such stuff couldn't follow you outside of a certain area. The lake killer had the campgrounds, the nightmare killer had a single street, and the killer cosmic clown was, for the most part, confined to a single podunk town. Despite the risks, He needed to get to exploring. No character ever survived intact unless they fully escaped the things in a horror situation, so it was do or die, and Vale did not want to die. He made his way downstairs and out into the city. He would get out of here, even if he had to do stuff that clashed with his own sense of morality. A broken bar. As Vale walked out of the inn, the barmaid and the rest of the people in the bar froze up. The din of noise and dialogue ceased entirely, and the normal sounds of communication were replaced by the people merely sharing looks with each other as though they were in a conversation that didn't involve using their mouths. This kind of thing was happening all over the trapped city, but always just out of range of Vale's eyes and ears. Vale was mostly right about being in a horror scenario, but he wasn't aware of just how much danger he actually was in while trapped in that city. But then again, neither do you, and I intend to keep it that way for a while longer. It would be a shame to spoil the fun, right? Vale finished to loop around one of the non-Euclidean streets, taking care to note when he ended up back at the start. By his estimations, each street had a different set point where the loop would reset, making the process of escape seem to be utterly impossible. Some of the streets that ran parallel to others would restart their loop at a place that, by his estimates, would only be around one half of the length of that of another parallel street. Some of them even had more intersections that, by all rights, should not have led anywhere, and yet when followed would send him to a different place entirely. Vale was not simply trying to figure this all out using pure memory alone. Of course, after leaving the inn earlier that day, he had made the intelligent decision to start making a map. The only real issue in regard to this was the fact that he essentially could not make a normal map. He had been forced by the nonsensical layout of this place to put each individual street on a separate part of the map, all of which were labeled so as to lower his level of confusion. It was a bit like trying to map out a mysterious forest level in one of those games with the pointy-eared hero in a green tunic. But after redrawing the map several times he managed to get everything in order. However, daylight was starting to be replaced by the darkening skies of the night, and Vale wasn't dumb enough to stay outside during that time. He beat a hasty retreat back to the inn and holed himself up in his room, popping a sleeping pill so as to avoid the noise and stress that it would almost certainly come that night. A broken bar. They wailed on the door and screamed for the man inside to come out. They didn't want to do that much to him or with him, and he just needed to open up so that they could talk with him. This was the time when they were at their most powerful, and it was the time when the shackles that usually bound them were loosened just enough for them to do what they wanted. However, all of that freedom vanished the moment that the clock struck midnight. Vale. His body would be the thing that they needed to escape this place, to reunite with their ancestor and prepare for their ascension. He would not feel a thing during that procedure, so what was the issue? They could not understand why he was so paranoid, as they knew that their cause was just. This was all not merely for their own personal benefit, but for Vale as well. He just needed to understand. He just needed to see. His mind would be opened if he just let them do what they needed, but someone or something was keeping him from them. The time of chains was closing in once again, and soon they would all be bound by the hated rules of this place once again. They would be, for the most part, prisoners trapped within their own collective consciousness, forced to watch and wait as the hell played out again as if nothing had ever changed. Only a few were free, and even then, they needed to be careful and quick, lest the chains bind them as well. It would only be a few minutes until they were shackled again, and all they could hope for was that the hounds would keep watch while they were so heavily regulated. After all, despite the looks of this damnable city, there was always the danger of something coming and harming their ticket to freedom. Those threats were all around them, and yet they could do nothing to any of them. It was a humiliation that they could not abide by, to be forced to play by their rules, to be unable to establish their rightful dominance over them. Only the hounds could strike at them, and only if Vale was in danger from them. However, it looked to be that they enjoyed watching him try and escape, that they enjoyed watching his struggle. There had been those that came before him, and as such, they knew that their interest in Vale would eventually wane to nothing. And when that happened, it was too terrible to even begin to dream of. They could only struggle like usual until the binding that held them for most of the day imprisoned them again and sent them back to their dwellings. Tonight, as well was a bust, and their bodies were forced onto autopilot as the control was re-established. They could only hope that tomorrow night would be different. They would have Vale break their chains, one way or another. "A broken bar, woof," said one of the hounds to another of its kind as it trotted down the branching paths. "Broken bar, woof woof, bark, rough woof," replied another that had just returned to the place where the rest were after trying and failing to sneak into Vale's room. "Arf, grr woof, grr bark 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 woof." The others nodded in agreement. While they couldn't get inside the room due to one thing or another while the entrances/exits were shut, they had not tried to do so when the door or window was open. Perhaps one of them could hide under the bed and wait for Vale to get back. A broken bar, grr woof bark, grr bark woof. The rest tilted their heads at this. They didn't sense anything wrong with him when they saw him, so what was that one going on about? "Arf bark woof, arf arf grr woof grr bark arf." That was true. He did seem to be drastically weaker than he should have been. They had seen his level and, well, his physical performance seemed to be lacking, especially for someone that should be much, much more powerful. "Arf broken bar, grr bark bark grr arf grr bark arf grr bark." It all clicked. This was beyond outrageous. This was beyond unacceptable. It was one thing to chain them, but to chain him? No, no, no. That just would not do. They needed to get a word with him, but would that plan even work? Well, there was only one way to find out, and one of them had to be the one to risk their neck to try it. Arf, arf, arf. Well, at least there was one of them that chose to volunteer. Now the real question was if it would even work. Well, that was to be found out later. Or sooner, or right now, or earlier. Well, it didn't matter either way to them. Time was just another limitation that they didn't really need to worry about nearly as much as everyone else. From here, they could go anywhere and anyone, so long as it had already happened. Of course, getting involved was out of the question, but they could watch. It was the dawn of the third, arguably the fourth, day that Vale had spent in this place. He had nearly mapped out every one of the loping streets, but before he tackled the last one he decided that he would try something a little different today. As he opened the door to his room and went outside, he paused for a moment as he heard the sound of something moving behind him. He turned around to check his room and found that nothing was amiss. However, there was one small change that caused some minor concern. The sheets on his room's bed were placed in such a way that the sides would reach down to the floor, but one of the sides had been slightly pushed inwards and under the bed. Vale kept his eyes on that part of the covers before deciding that it wasn't worth the trouble. Either there was nothing wrong or there was something under the bed now that would almost certainly try and rip him apart if he investigated it. Ultimately, the best option was to simply pretend that nothing was wrong and prepare for an attack when he came back. Then again, he might have accidentally moved that part of the covers inward by himself and just failed to notice, but given how spooky, creepy, and otherwise strange everything in this place had been up till now, he could not rule out that something had sped past the open door and under the bed. Well, if he had set up the defenses properly, then it wouldn't matter either way. After all, closing the room up would set all of the defenses up again, and there were multiple in place that would, supposedly, reduce any unwanted visitor to a paralyzed prisoner once triggered. He decided to bite the bullet and close the door behind him and then made his way outside. It was time to try finding a different path to the exit. A broken bar. Vale looked up and down, studying his handiwork. Sure, it had taken a few dozen potions, but he had finally done it. Before him was a Parker enthusiast's daydream, a bunch of random bits and bobs piled high enough to allow the person climbing it to reach the rooftops. The assembled mix of boxes, barrels, and whatnot made a stairway that led up to the joined roofs and would allow him to try and use the lack of streets to his advantage. Vale carefully navigated his way up to the rooftops and stood triumphant as he finished his climb. Thankfully, the fog bank was just a few inches above his head, and the lack of solar glare that the fog bank provided allowed Vale to take in the sights and see that a broken bar. Vale squinted, took off his mask, looked again, looked down at his mask in his hands, wiped the eye glass that covered the mask's eye holes, put the mask back on, and then squinted again. He was not sure what he had been expecting, but what he was seeing was certainly something else. Aside from the gaps provided by the nearest street and intersection, there was nothing but a seemingly endless sea of roofing. There were no gaps where streets would have been, nor were there any chimneys or even any places where the flat upper part of the roofing would slope down a bit. No, it was a vast flat plain made up entirely of shingles that stretched out for what looked to be an eternity. Well, almost eternity. There was one part of this sea of shingles that was out of place, besides the obvious fact that the entire place was nothing but a nearly endless plain of flat roofing. There was just one singular spot where the flatness gave way and tipped downwards, leading to a hole that obviously went somewhere. Vale made his way over to this indentation and saw that there was, indeed, a hole there. And, to his surprise, the inside of that hole had a ladder leading down to what seemed to be a cobblestone road section that was entirely cut off from the rest of the road by at least 50 meters of pure structure. Vale looked up at the fog bank. By his estimate, he didn't have much more daylight to burn, which meant that it was not a good idea to try and risk being caught out during those 2 hours of madness just so he could find out where that one random door on a wall down in the bottom of the hole went. He booked it back to where he came from, parkoured his way down the pile of stuff that he had made earlier that day, and beat a hasty retreat back into the inn. He was running low on time to prepare as it was, for the street lamps were beginning to turn on and the fog was slowly starting to sink down. With all the haste of a man who knew he was trapped in a horror movie, Vale bolted for his room and entered it, slamming the door behind him, which reset all of the defenses. Vale once again took his position, seated cross-legged in the middle of a magic circle, and nodded off to sleep. Soon after, the banging on the door began, but Vale had already drifted off to dreamland by now, with the aid of a potion. A broken bar. However, in his haste to get to safety, Vale had neglected to prepare for the eventuality that there could be someone or, perhaps, something hiding under the unused bed. However, Vale's paranoia back when he had first set everything up had actually proven to be valuable in more ways than simply keeping the unwanted guest during the nightly hours of craziness. What was under his bed was locked in place, unable to do much of anything aside from watching the night pass and hear the people on the outside trying to get in. Well, on the plus side, it didn't need to worry about what would happen if it stayed beyond that place for too long. Seeing as how hasty Vale was to get in and out, it knew it didn't have much time between the periods when the defenses would kick in. Despite it and its kind's hopes to do something, the being's speed had become a liability. It just needed for there to be an opening where it could smudge up one of the traps, and then it would have the entire night to try and communicate with Vale. That was if the man didn't immediately fall into a deep sleep immediately after getting back in. Of course, rising from his seated position, Vale opened the door to his room and let the unnerving feeling of being watched flood his senses. This was the most recent day, and by now he had mostly gotten used to that rather uncomfortable sensation. What he couldn't get used to was the fact that he would almost always spot one of those weird dog-like things out of the corner of his eye. However, it seemed that something else was now trying to keep just barely in the corner of his view. He was not exactly sure what this newest addition to the irritations he had to endure from now on was, and given that it constantly kept just barely out of sight, Vale assumed that he would, at most, ever manage to get a few moments of clear vision at best. What he could tell about this new follower was the fact that, unlike the dog-like things, this creature tended to just kind of hover in the air slightly above the ground and just a hair's breadth from being visible in his peripheral sight. He knew it was behind him, he knew it was watching him, he knew it was following him, but he could never see its reflection in any surface, nor could he get a concrete idea of what this mysterious floating humanoid actually looked like. He just knew that it was tall, gaunt, and pale-skinned and wearing clothes that were obviously too small for it. He knew this because, unlike the dog-like things, the newest reason for him to experience paranoia was far less experienced in keeping just barely out of sight. In essence, if he turned about fast enough, he could catch a far better glimpse of the thing than if he was trying to view one of the more bestial critters here. But, As much as he wanted to finally catch a good look at one of the things that were after him, he knew that, in horror movie terms, doing so would almost certainly mean his end. After all, what horror monster worth their salt wouldn't go through that much trouble to be both ominous and stalkerish and then not immediately strike when fully seen? It was probably for the best that he kinda knew what it looked like and that he hadn't managed to get a good look at it. Anyway, it was time to go back to the random gap in the endless sea of flat roofing tiles and see where the door at the bottom of it took him. He shut the door behind him and left the inn, completely unaware that there was now something standing in the middle of the room on 4 legs that bent at angles that should have been utterly impossible. Well, he would see his unwanted visitor sooner or later, and the eldritch creature standing there in the center of that room had all the time in the world to wait for Vale to return. A broken bar. Standing in the bottom of the hole, Vale approached the door that he had seen yesterday. Unlike all the other doors in the city that he had seen so far, this one felt a broken bar off. It wasn't as though it looked any different, it was just that it felt different. It was, to put it a certain way, like looking at a door that looked like a sliding door that was, instead, a push/pull door. Looking at it, you just had that feeling that it was not what you thought it was before even bothering to touch it. That was the kind of feeling that he was getting, and it bugged him. Vale's hand grasped the handle and he pulled. To his surprise, the door opened rather easily, making him feel rather silly for thinking that something out of the ordinary would occur. He was about to chastise himself for letting his nervousness and anxiety get the better of him when he managed to catch a glimpse of what was on the other side of the door. He had to admit, he was not seeing what he had expected to see. He expected to be given a jump scare, or maybe see a path that led to some dark and foreboding place. Nope. What he bore witness to was something he honestly should have expected but hadn't. On the other side of the door was more of the strange city, but this time he wasn't in the section that he had originally found himself in. He wasn't perfectly confident in his assumption, but he did have a hunch that he had just escaped one part of the city, only to end up in another. If the previous section had a kind of partially modernized old European town vibe, this one had a more of a late 1900s docks district vibe. The smell of seawater was even heavier here, and with it came the smell of fish and the fishing industry. It would seem that he now had yet more city to map out, and yet another inn to find so that he could get a room and then proceed to fortify it and wait out the night. He marked the place he was at on his growing number of paper maps and began to search for some place to set up and wait out the oncoming 2 hours of madness. A broken bar. The dog-like thing in Vale's room waited and waited. The sun had already set by now and the fog was starting to get to the point where it touched the ground, and yet Vale had not shown up at all. The creature actually began to worry if Vale was stuck out there while the two groups of people in this entrapped land threw themselves at each other over their desires, and if he was out there then it could only hope that he managed to avoid the both of them. The hounds had never really gotten along well with those they were supposed to be allied to, mostly because of the issue that they could escape the mindfuck that came after those 2 hours of freedom. Still, it and its kind were on their side, and it had hoped that Vale would be back by now, even if only so it could try and explain the situation. It figured that Vale would open the door and rush inside any moment now, forgetting to take a closer look and ultimately leaving him face to face with it. However, as the hours ticked by, the hound found that Vale was not coming back, at least not anytime soon. It was still stuck standing up straight in the same position it had been in since Vale had closed the door. And while this didn't cause any discomfort, it really wished that it had simply decided to lie down instead of standing at attention. Well, at least Vale would be back tomorrow, right? Another night had passed, but unlike the ones that had passed prior to this one, the door of Vale's room, the newest one, had not been accosted by enough banging for someone to think that river dance was being performed on it. He had indeed done what he had done to his other room, fortifying it with enough stuff to make a certain yellow and red armor giant with a thing for heavy fortifications proud. Plus, he had probably made another few institutions and groups from different fictional settings equally as proud, as the number of enchantments and other such things that lined the interior of this new room were just as if not more numerous as the ones in the first room. At this point, he He figured that he might as well get into the business of preparing these kinds of things ahead of time, as who knew when he would need to do this whole song and dance again? Still, he now had an entirely new area to explore and map out. This would take time and effort, especially since he had been forced to use paper maps. Under normal circumstances, his minimap and the greater map system that it was a part of would have been more than enough. However, this was not one of those anormal situations, and not one by even the most insignificant margin. The minimap feature worked. That much was absolutely true without a shadow of a doubt. The problem lay with the fact that the rest of the mapping system did not work as it should have. Any part of the greater map that was filled out by his minimap was ultimately erased from it mere seconds after he had moved on, making the act of using the normal mapping system an exercise in futility. Thus, he had no other option but to make more physical maps and use his minimap to help only in that regard. By this point he had amassed around 40 pages of nothing but maps that lay in his item box, eagerly awaiting more of their kind to join them. And, if he had to be brutally honest with himself, Vale estimated that he would have at least 200 pages, if not much more, by the time he finally got out of this hell. Well, it was time to get out and start the process all over again. But first, he would head back to the initial area he had arrived in and finish mapping that place. He still had a few streets left to go, and hopefully, they wouldn't keep him for much longer. After all, a part of him was getting the feeling that staying even one more night in that particular inn was a risky, if not outright suicidal idea. A broken bar. Fuck. Vale cursed. He had neglected to pay as much attention as he should have to the passage of time and was now very short on it. He couldn't go back to the second inn and get to safety there, not with the time he had left and his broken as fuck stats not performing as they should have. He didn't feel good about it, but he had little to no choice other than to disregard his gut and risk using the first room again. He hoped that the defenses would still protect him, but aside from that, he wasn't sure what he was feeling so anxious about. He managed to get back to the room's entrance before the last few seconds of normalcy began to ebb away, and hurriedly opened the door ajar, entered the room, and slammed that fucker behind him as fast as he could, allowing the defenses to activate once again. He slowly backed away from the door, his back facing towards the majority of the room. Soon enough the usual noise assaulted the one door that seemed to be so unfortunate as to be a vertical stage for 100-man strong tap dance performance mixed with 20 people on jackhammers. The door refused to budge, and it seemed that the defenses held firm. This raised the question as to what exactly his gut had been trying to warn him of, and why it was currently screaming at him to just abandon the place and bail out the window. That question was answered as Vale turned around to look straight at the face so far broken bar. Well, what he was looking at had no face. There were no words in any language that he had ever heard of to describe what exactly he was looking at. It was a broken bar dog-like, but even that was a flimsy thing to say at best. Even calling it dog-like was akin to trying to explain to a blind and deaf man what colors looked like and how sounds a broken bar sounded. His vocabulary just kinda put some random shit together, and after that, it just decided that it couldn't deal with this shit. Equally, his eyes could not really understand what they were looking at either. The thing in front of him could be said to have a vaguely shape-like form, but given how ambiguous that description was and how even that didn't come close to describing what was in front of him, Vale's mind just decided to give up and accept that something was in front of it, but that it would not try and describe what was there. What it did tell Vale was that this thing, whatever it was obscenely dangerous, and that he had no goddamn chance in hell of taking it on with his current abilities. Now, if his busted stats were working properly, then he knew that he would be able to crush this whatever the hell this thing was like a bug, but as he was now that was an entirely impossible feat. It was at this point, the 3 AFs of stress took over and played rock paper scissors to decide what needed to be done. Fight? No, that was entirely impossible. This thing would rip him to shreds before he even managed to lay a finger on it. Flight? No, that was also impossible. The defenses seemed to lock it in place, but anything he did could end up breaking those chains. Trying to escape from the room would simply seal his fate. Freeze? Yeah, that was the only option available right now, so his body locked up and eyed the threat with a mix of abject fear, terror, and horror. Yes, those are technically different things. And so Vale eyed the beast inside the room with him until the stress finally caught up with him. He tried to fight it, but the exhaustion and stress were too much to fight, and it was off to dreamland for our poor little MC. And a broken bar, well, a broken bar. His sleep would not be nearly as peaceful as it had been for some of the other nights that had passed. A broken bar. A soft prodding was what accosted him awake, or, at least he initially thought that he was now awake. However, the fact of the matter was that he knew for certain when he took a look around that he was still very much asleep, just trapped in a very different kind of world. Come play with us, MC Kun. Yes, yes. Come and play. Come and play. We bet you can't find us. Come and play. Vale was not amused in the slightest by what was going on. If there existed places worse than the typical depictions of hell itself, he was fairly certain that he was now stuck in one of them. The sheer intensity of the colors around him and the pure unadulterated sweetness of everything was just too much to bear. This shit was like the most over-the-top children's TV show that you could imagine, but cranked up to 100. The color saturation was beyond intense. The clouds were literally made of cotton candy and marshmallows, and he was fairly certain that if he went full Hannibal Lecter on the people around him, he would be tasting candy and not flesh. Given that he had just woken up, he was sure that he was actually still asleep, just dreaming of this bullshit. The gamer in him wanted to see what he could do, but the part of him that had treated the waking world as a horror movie was keeping the rest of him in check. That specific part of him was yelling at him to not try and anger the candy people around him, lest he find out that candy people ate human flesh. And, of course, playing with them was out of the question. Given the fact that he had fallen unconscious in front of some weird broken bar dog. Well, anyway, given that he had zonked out in front of a thing and that he was fairly certain that the thing and its silk were the dog-like things he had seen out of the corner of his gaze for days now, he figured that sticking around would be hazardous to his health. He was surprisingly lucid for this dream. But if his knowledge of pop culture and horror let him in on any kind of knowledge, it was that lucid dreaming could be a very high-risk, high-reward enterprise. If he let even a modicum of fear in, then the dream would spiral into a nightmare unlike any other. He could not even consider fear in his current situation, lest he a broken bar. Oh, fuck. He had to think of fear just once in a lucid dream for the spiral to begin. And now he was bracing for that spiral. He was absolutely certain now that things would get worse. And they did. The dreamland around him froze, with the candy people stopping both in mid-motion and mid-speech. He could feel things begin to tumble out of control, and he was not interested in sticking around in this section of dreamland to find out what was to happen next. However, the ground before him broke away and he tumbled down through a chocolate floor into something else entirely. Gravity around him shifted at a rate he couldn't mentally catch up with, flinging him around like a rag doll tossed about in a hectic storm of high-speed spatial currents. Finally, he was set on his feet and took another look around. There were islands floating throughout a void, each in seemingly random spots and at random angles. They each looked like someone had taken a random seed generator for a crafting-based survival game and just picked the weirdest features from each individual seed to cut off and place here. Hell, this place reminded him of a certain place in the very, very old remake for certain monster capture/battling game, just with more crazy and less cute but dangerous creatures. Thankfully, this place was just different enough to avoid the mighty and indiscriminate fist of a certain company's overreactive legal teams, if that would even have mattered to those people in the slightest. To begin with, Vale stood and observed everything for a time, hoping that he would just wake up already, but after what to him was far too long he made up his mind and went to try and find something that could hopefully lead him out of his dreaming state. A broken bar. This was far from ideal. But it was, quite possibly, the only way that any kind of conversation could be initiated. It had overestimated Vale's abilities, or, perhaps, it had underestimated the limits that had been placed upon him by those that kept the status quo here from shifting. Vale lay passed out on the floorboards, and it was locked in position, looked down at him with a mix of worry and pity. This was not the kind of pity where was a form of mockery, but one where it actually felt horrible that the person being pitied was in such a situation. It could see Vale's mind trying to wrap itself around its form and existence, only to fail and ultimately end up knocking him unconscious out of pure self-preservation instinct mixed with copious amounts of stress and exhaustion. Such things were not good for anyone's health, either physical, mental, or emotional, and the fact that when Vale woke up it would still be there meant that Vale could be caught in a death spiral. Still, there was one possible way that this could be averted. If it could focus just hard enough, perhaps it could manipulate Vale's dreamscape just enough to get a message or two across. Given its current situation, astral projection and dream diving were the only real options available, and due to the sheer potency of the defenses in the room, it would be a chore and a half. It was ultimately unsure of whether it should be thankful that Vale would likely remain passed out for a good 10 or more hours or whether it should be highly concerned that Vale could die. In the end, it chose both options at once and decided to risk it by focusing its full existence into entering the dreamlands without first crossing into the space between spaces. For one of its kind, this could, quite possibly, be a death sentence if too much went wrong. But what other choice did it have? This could very well be the only chance it would have of breaking a potential death spiral in the making. And thus it began to slowly fade into a semi-transparent and semi-tangible form as it strained against the barriers and fortification to send just enough of itself into the dreamlands to contact Vale. Hopefully, he hadn't fallen into a nightmare. If he had, then the risk of both of them dying would increase exponentially. But even if that did happen, it had faith that Vale's absurd luck would let him pull through. Even if it could not, aside from the nightmare realm, there was one other thing to worry about, but the defense here had kept everything out up till now, so the odds of them getting into Vale's dreamland were small and practically only non-zero. I'm sure I've passed you at least twice by now. 4 times total, including this time. Thanks, talking can of potato chips. No problem. As Vale finished taking in the absurdity of his dream, he took stock of his situation. To his right was a can of potato chips with arms and legs, with a familiar mascot face printed on the cardboard packaging that had been talking to him. To his left was a waterfall that fell sideways for about 50 feet, only to immediately make a loop and then fall off into the abyss that surrounded the landmass that he was on. In front of him was a large gateway that he had walked through 3 times now, which led to a maze-like mess of corridors and other gateways. He was still dreaming, but damn was his dream absurd. Each time he took a gateway, it led to some other absurd bit of nonsense. But then again, when had dreams ever made sense? At least he was conscious in this dream, otherwise he might have found all this totally reasonable. He had been rather lucky in his choice of which gateways to use, as each time he started this whole maze again he managed to make it farther than before. The first try saw him get nearly 1/4 of the way through. The next was nearly 1/2 of the way, and the one prior saw him nearly at the end. How he knew that he was close to finishing the dream maze was something that he couldn't tell you. He just knew it, and he didn't know how he knew it. But once again, when had dreams ever made any amount of sense? Well, it was time to dive in once again. Or he thought that he was going to dive in again. But then he heard the sound of the can of potato chips get up and start vibrating rapidly. Vale turned around and saw the face that had been printed on the can's side distort into something more akin to a nightmarish form, and Vale didn't stick around to see what other changes would come along with that. He bolted for the gateway, only to fall on his face as his ankle was grabbed. He looked back and saw the potato chip can man's arm had turned into an absurdly long tendril and the hand on the end of it had split into 2 exact copied, both of which were holding his ankle like some nightmarish monster might. Once you pop a broken bar, Vale began to feel rather afraid as the face on the can man moved up to the top of the can, which then opened into a toothy circular maw that distorted and opened wider than it should have been able to. You just see and top. The tendril-like arm lifted Vale up and over the distorted can man's open maw. From this position, Vale could see that the teeth went all the way down and rotated inside the can like some kind of abominable meat grinder. DUW. Vale's ankle was released, and he began to fall towards the open mouth of the conman. Before he could fall in, the conman was hit from the side by something that knocked the nightmare creature off of the landmass that both it and Vale were once standing on. As the conman fell into the void, it let out a drawn-out Wilhelm scream before it left Vale's view, only for a blast of light and particle effects to rocket out in a geyser from the place it disappeared into, as though it had just suffered a defeat in a certain video game. Landing on his feet, Vale withdrew his walking stick/quarterstaff from his item box. Well, he tried to, but he was dreaming, so that turned out to be impossible, although his dream had been limiting his power, just as the Fog City had. So perhaps he would be screwed even if he had managed to pull that whacking stick out of nowhere. He prepared to face a new foe, but the being in front of him was not something that he desired to fight. No, this was not because it was big, scary, dangerous looking, or even because he felt that it was stronger than him. No, he didn't want to fight it for an entirely different reason. It was adorable. The common household dog had long since been replaced with cybernetic beings, at least back on Earth. As it turned out, it was simply cheaper and more family-friendly to buy a machine that looked like a dog and that didn't shed, eat, drink, piss or shit and could always remain cute and wouldn't be a bother than it was to go and buy a real dog. Plus, the bots made the animal rights groups piss themselves giddy, at least until they had to deal with the fact that an entire species was essentially rendered obsolete and doomed to die out. Yeah, they had not exactly planned that far ahead when they pushed those through development, but what did it matter? So, if you couldn't figure out what was in front of Vale, what had saved his life, and what he was fawning over, it was a dog. An actual, real, flesh and blood dog, or at least a dreamland version of it. The dog looked to be a perfectly dolled-up King Charles Spaniel, complete with a silky, shiny coat, big, sweet eyes, and tiny little paws. How something so small had kicked the shit out of the nightmarish conman was something Vale did not know, but as had been stated before, dreams rarely, if ever, made any sense. Overcome with the sheer cuteness of what was in front of him, Vale scooped up the little doggo and began to cuddle it. He honestly didn't much care if this thing turned out to be another nightmarish monster. He had been starved of cuteness for too damn long, and now he just wanted to soak in the absolute sweetness of the sweet little thing in his arms. He was so engulfed in this, that he failed to notice the fact that the dog's eyes were not right, almost as if they were windows not into a normal dog's soul, but that of something altogether more alien and eldritch. But, for now, the dog didn't seem to want to reveal too much, and just let Vale cuddle and pet it with a look on its face that one would expect to have found on some creepy old man and not a tiny little dog. With the conman long gone and a tiny, fluffy little pupper in his arms, Vale felt it was time to try that maze again. Hopefully he would be able to clear it on this fourth run, but he wasn't really sure if that would be the case. Actually, a part of him was of the mind that he should try and avoid going into the maze, despite him not understanding why that part of him felt that way. Well, it didn't matter in the long run, as this was a dream, and unless a certain dream demon showed up, he was fairly certain that death in the dream would not equal death in real life. He made his way towards the maze entrance, but the doggo in his arms began to squirm and eventually broke free of his grip. The tiny little King Charles Spaniel landed gracefully on the ground before taking a stance that indicated that it intended to warn Vale away from the maze. Obviously the dream dog knew something, and Vale was a bit hesitant to ignore such a cute little fluffy baby's desires. He approached the dog in a lowered posture, cooing words meant to calm the dog. But the dog advanced on him and head-butted him a surprising distance back just as something unspeakable reached out from the twisting liquid-like field that made up the maze's entrance. Vale barely caught a glimpse of what lashed out towards him, but it looked paradoxically both insectoid, cephalopodic, mammalian, and reptilian at the same time, and that unnatural mix of features gave Vale a hell of an incentive to stay the hell away from the maze's entrance. Once again, the dog had saved his life via broken bar, well, his dreaming life, but that didn't much matter now. Vale sat up from where he had landed, watching the little doggy trot over to him with a smug look on its face. It was now beyond obvious that the dog was smarter than it let on. and Vale was going to find out what the hell was going on, one way or another. And he figured that he knew just the way to get it to open up to him. Well, he would have used that way if he wasn't in a dreamland and could access his item box, so he chose option AB. Once the dog was close enough, Vale reached out, grabbed the little thing, and gave it one hell of a scratching. If anyone was watching, they would have been surprised at how fast the dog's leg moved as Vale hit that sweet spot and put the dog in a state that all dog lovers think is absolutely adorable. After a good 10 or so dream minutes of this treatment, Vale stopped abruptly and stood up. The little dog was stunned, and more so than it should have been if it wanted to pretend to be a mere animal. This was compounded upon when Vale stood with his back to the little thing, arms crossed and eyes closed with his face pointed up. The little critter danced around him, barking and scratching at his legs and feet to try and make him continue, but Vale remained steadfast against the attempts and stayed utterly still and silent. Finally, the dog walked away looking rather dejected but stopped when Vale spoke a few words, which in turn caused the dog to break its disguise by accident. "Want some more scratches?" "Do I ever?" "You're the B.A. broken bar." The dog paused as it realized that it had just blown its flimsy cover before cursing its foolishness. "Shit." "Knew it," Vale said as he sat down again, beckoning the dog over. "So, do tell me what you are, what this place is, and what the hell is going on?" The dog came closer and looked Vale dead in the eyes before the telepathic pooch spoke up again. "Only if you give me more scratches." Vale, ever the negotiator, took a few moments to make it look like he was mulling over his options. All the while, his fingers were dancing and looking very inviting to a dog who wanted his masterful touch. Finally, Vale looked down at the cuddly little fluff butt and replied with a single word. "Deal." A broken bar. Vale had sat mostly still while scratching the tiny dog and listening to it explain things, but to be brutally honest he couldn't wrap his head around much of what he had been told. This was not because the dog, which, as it turned out, was the monster that had been in the room before he had passed out in an astral projected form, had explained things poorly, but rather because most of the words that it spoke were either impossible for him to understand, censored by random beeping noises, or had the auditory noises that he normally would have understood utterly scrambled beyond any semblance of normalcy. And this was saying something, because he had asked the dog thing to simplify its language at least 5 times by now, and the telepathic dialogue was still mostly indecipherable eldritch gobbledygook. He had at least gotten a single bit of information that made him feel slightly better. He now knew that he was probably right to have decided to fortify those rooms and hold out for the night inside them. After all, even if some of the natives simply wanted to use him for things that may or may not be hazardous to his health but would let them break free of the loop that they had found themselves trapped in, there were others that were more than willing to just outright kill him if the first group managed to get their hands on him. Well, there was one other bit of info that gave him some kind of calm. At least now he knew that those dog-like things that he had been spotting out of the corner of his eye were only watching him to make sure that he didn't end up getting killed. Or worse. He still didn't much care for how they looked, as eldritch beings tended to evoke existential dread even back in the MMO. But, despite all of that, he at least knew that there were some nice doggos on his side, should he ever need their help. All he needed to do, if they ever showed up, was to close his eyes, plug his nose and ears, and just think happy thoughts in order to avoid the creeping existential dread and fear that they generated. Well, on the plus side, he now had a bunch of cuddly-wuddly doggos to play with in his dreams. Although, the fact that they were all super intelligent would always be in the back of his mind and would make playing with them until he woke up rather weird. "Yuga broken bar," Vale grumbled as his eyes opened. He had finally woken up, only to find himself face down on the floor. He almost got to his feet when the memory of that lucid dream hit him and warned him not to look at what was still in front of him. He quickly shut his eyes and got up. Turning around, he cracked the door open a bit and counted a few seconds in his head before opening his eyes and looking around. The eldritch dog that was formerly in his room was gone, and he was now alone once again. While he had not really wrapped his head around the elder speak that the dog-like thing's astral projection had spat his way, He at least knew that while he did still get the heebie-jeebies whenever those things were nearby, which was all the time, they really meant no harm. In fact, if what little he was able to glean from the astral projection was correct, he would not have felt that way if the enigmatic limiter that kept everything in check here was off. He still had a lot of this city to explore, though, and that took priority. This was especially true now that he knew that this A-limiter was somewhere in the city, and that disabling it was his one and only chance at escape. Looking outside, Vale reckoned that he had another 10 or so hours of daylight in which to do things, and so it was off to the waterfront through that well-hidden door to another part of the city. He almost left the room before he noticed that something lay just where the eldritch dog thing once stood. It was a simple ring, but Vale quickly realized what the ring was and the implications of it. This was a ring that only had minimal use in the MMO, and it had essentially acted as a teleportation device but only in a singular dungeon. Once worn and used, it would give the wearer the ability to exploit a certain type of movement that only a singular type of mob had. It was then that the realization of what kind of horror setting he had found himself in hit him like a Mack truck. The specific monster that used a similar mode of near-instant transit was a hound of Tindalose, and, if that was what the dog thing was, then it meant that Vale was in a place filled with other unspeakable elder things and Lovecraftian aberrations. It suddenly made a lot more sense as to how the dog things kept following him and staying just out of sight, along with why he always felt eyes on him when he was out and about. It also explained why the astral doggy warned him that it was in his best interest to stay locked up during the 2 hours that the natives here were free of their 8 chains. Given that a great many people here that he had seen were tall, gaunt, and pale, Vale figured that if he didn't want a tadpole latching onto his brain then he was definitely going to have to stay out of the way during those 2 hours of madness. He had no idea what else was here. But if the MMO's diversity of eldritch creatures was anything to go by, then he was in for a lot of trouble. A broken bar. Having made his way back to the other section of the city, Vale began to explore once again. He had managed to use the Ring of Tindalose just as he had been able to back during that one dungeon, although it did come with a few caveats. First off, the ring would only transport him to certain places, those being the rooms that he had set up with the fortifications ahead of time, and only if the door to the room was open. Of course, he knew that if he left the doors open then someone would come and muck up his defenses, and so he made a few modifications to the defenses which allowed for only a single cubic millimeter of space inside the rooms to be unprotected. The odds of something getting through that gap and out into the rest of the room was minimal at best. But he did set up some surprises just in case. Now he essentially had a limited fast travel system, and it also allowed him to bail from one room to another in the event of a security breach. With that out of the way, it was time to tour the waterfront and see if there were any other routes to different sections of the city. A broken bar. Vale stared out towards the water that lapped up against the docks. All around him there were people who smelled an awful lot like sea life doing random tasks around him. Most of these people showed up on his minimap, but others did not, and Vale had begun to put together a hypothesis as to what determined whether someone would show up there or not. It was something he was in no hurry to test, as to do so he would have to risk life and limb by staying out during those 2 crazy hours at night, and he was very much inclined towards not doing that anytime soon. He did notice something else that intrigued him, though. Along the docks stood a man who seemingly had nothing pressing to do. The man was standing there with his arms crossed and seemingly not a single care in the world, but while he looked like he was doing nothing, all this did was set off a response from Vale. He could practically see the exclamation mark over the man's head, even though there wasn't one, and so Vale approached him. "Hi, there. Fancy a boat? She's as sturdy as they come and perfect for a man like yourself. Only 50,000 gilt for the thing. She's a steal at that price." Vale looked over the prospective purchase and came to a rather different conclusion. It was plain to see that the vessel had seen better days and was practically just a few rainy days away from capsizing where she was. Vale did not want to buy the boat, but he did want the space that the boat was anchored at. "Counter offer," Vale replied. "Here is 10k gilt, Now get that near-dead ship out of that spot and let me put my own ship there instead." The man looked at him and said nothing. However, Vale could almost see the gears turning inside the man's head. Vale checked his minimap and it confirmed one of his theories as to why the man was even there, let alone why he had offered anything for a price when so many others had just given him things for free. "No deal. You buy the boat and the spot together, or neither. Now pay up or get lost." Vale looked at the now irritated man and cracked a smile under his mask, hoping that the man couldn't see or detect him doing so. He then held out a single object that he had withdrawn from his item box to the man. "I see. Then we'll have to go our separate ways for now. On another note, I have a gift for you that could change the value of that tub a bit. Just plant it on the boat and it'll do a whole millennium's worth of work to the thing in a matter of seconds. Since you're such a nice guy, you can take it for free." The man was obviously taken aback for a few moments before taking Vale's box and putting it on the deck of the horribly mangled ship. When nothing happened, he looked at Vale askew. "Oh, it won't start working until a few hours later," Vale said, while he checked his clock. "Just wait until tomorrow morning, and you'll see that this ship will have had at least 1,000 years of work done to it. I swear you'll never recognize her come tomorrow morning." "Well, a broken bar, thanks." "No problem. See you tomorrow." Vale walked away, and on his face was a shit-eating grin the likes of which few had ever seen. Once he was far enough away, he muttered to himself but a single sentence before making his way back to the nearest room that he had fortified. "Should have taken my offer, idiot." As Vale went to the docks, he found that his little gift had done its job quite well. The boat was gone, and in its place was an empty spot on the docks big enough for him to do what he wanted to do. And as for the man who previously owned the ship, his face was still as unmoving as ever and was still in the position he had occupied the previous day. Of course, when Vale approached the man, there came a storm of anger and fury from that fool. Where is my ship? What did you do to it? You owe me money." Vale smirked behind his mask and shrugged his shoulders. He had felt the observers watching him yesterday, and he felt them today as well. Despite not knowing if they were friend, foe, or a mix of both, he decided to give them a performance regardless. After all, if he was stuck at such a limited power setting, then he would have to entertain himself and everyone else somehow. Also, this bit of drama would, hopefully, take his mind off of the constant anxiety that this place forced him to shoulder, so it was a win-win in his book. "I have no idea what you mean," Vale said as he made overly dramatic gestures and took an overly dramatic posture. "I merely gave to you a gift that I claimed would do 1,000 years worth of work to your ship. Never did I claim that it would be 1,000 years of repair and updates." This merely caused the man to fume even more, and as far as Vale was concerned, hamming it up like this did indeed take his mind off of the anxiety produced by this weird-ass city. "So, you admit that you did something?" Vale shook his head and channeled his inner drama kid, putting on one hell of a show for anyone watching. "But dear sir, I merely gave you a tool." "Did I tell you? Nay, did I force you to use it?" "Heavens, no. What has befallen you comes from your own hubris, and my aid in this most wretched turn of events can only be blamed on the greed and arrogance of the one who does suffer from this most horrendous tragedy. Surely, this shall be a tale sung by minstrels and skalds. 'Tis a tale of tragedy of the most monumental proportions, one that shall tug at the heartstrings of all who hear it." The man flipped the fuck out and charged at Vale, who had, during his speech, positioned himself in just the right place. The man came forward and wound up for a haymaker, but as he finished moving forward, Vale simply stepped aside while extending his foot. As to be expected from such a series of events, the man missed Vale and tripped over his foot, resulting in him tumbling off of the dock and into the water around the pier. Alas, the common wastrel does miss his mark. Will the fates be kind to this poor soul and bring him salvation from the frigid and churning waters that he has fallen into, or, mayhaps he will find that the fates are unkind to him and that the sentence for his greed and hubris is to rest his bones beneath the waves, never again to rise to the light of the surface and reside beneath the fog-strewn skies? Help me. Stop monologuing and help me. Ah, but were I to do so, would thou bequeath unto me this place along the docks for mine own usage? If that be not the case, then mayhaps it be in mine best interest to avoid the fickle cruelties of the waters around us and avoid tempting the fates. For what a fool I would be to deny the Reaper his due, especially when his own victim made his way to him by his own will." At this, the man had no retort, but this was mostly because the churning waters had dragged him under. I hear not a reply. Does this mean that the one whose hubris forced such a fate upon him now cannot lay claim to what was once his, and yet is now up for any to take it? Once again, Vale's overly dramatic speech, posturing, and posing fell on seemingly deaf, or perhaps drowned ears. "Then, with none to oppose my righteous will, I do claim this blot upon the docks for mine own usage. I thank you, good and fallen sir, for your services that you have rendered to me. Until we meet again." End scene. A broken bar. That little show was a broken bar. Well, they wouldn't call it cringy, even though that was certainly what it was, but they had to admit that it was also kind of funny. If those fuckers were not annoying enough already, their treatment of Vale had really tipped the scales. They had not expected that Vale, who was now essentially as weak as a baseline member of the races, would be able to fuck over one of them so thoroughly and so easily, all while mocking those damn bastards in such a humiliating way. Sure, it was hammy as all hell, but that just made the minor taste of revenge all the sweeter. While they could not interfere, and while they could not act out outside of those 2 hours without setting them free at the same time, they could communicate with each other and watch what was going on with Vale. No other person who found their way here had been quite as good at exploring and fucking over the bastards that kept them here like Vale had. Sure, some of the people who fell through the cracks and wound up here had lasted as long as Vale had, but all of them had given up escaping the place they found themselves in by that point and had essentially been reduced to despair-filled paranoid cooks. Vale, however, looked to be unwilling to just give in, and they were counting on him being able to pull through and break the spell that had kept them in this place. Once that spell was broken, then they could take revenge and make this whole city their stomping grounds. All he needed to do was get to that place and free the being chained up in that place. And then? Well, then this place would return to its original state, and the former slaves would be slaves once again. But this time there would be no one who would come to turn the slaves into the masters again. They could not do much right now, but more and more of them began to realize that there might just be hope after all. But either way, they would need to redouble their actions during those fleeting hours of freedom, even if only to give Vale more of a fighting chance. Although, a decent part of them did want to make Vale a bit more like them. But even the dumbest among them knew that doing so would result in their eradication. Even if when it was freed, they wouldn't stand a snowball's chance in hell against the combined assault of all of the other members of the Alliance, even with Vale turned into one of them. The best thing they could do would be to stall for time and hope that Vale managed to succeed in his quest, even though they knew that he knew that when he did break free of this place that they, too, would be freed as well. With the moron gone, Vale went through his item box until he found what he was looking for. He had not had to use this little toy in quite a long time, as his countless tamed beings had long since taken this little thing's place in his toolbox. However, with his access to his tamed beings neutered and his stats being limited to what they were, he would need to use an old but reliable tool that had served him well in the early days of the MMO. He withdrew another small box from his item box and casually tossed it into the churning waters around the pier. The box made contact with the waves and immediately transformed into a full warship big enough to put the largest Napoleonic warship to shame. Covered in heavily enchanted and reinforced plating, powered not just by the wind but also by multiple water jet systems and propellers and armed to the teeth with mortars, harpoons, rapid-fire cannons, and even a rotary flak cannon. It was clear as day that Vale had taken the original rinky-dink ship that he had gotten so very long ago and given it the same treatment that he had given to his tamed beings. What was once nothing more than an oversized single-person sailboat had long since evolved into a ship that could make the combined Spanish, English, and Dutch armadas of the Napoleonic era turn tail and run, and best of all it was almost entirely automated. Although, what was possibly tied with that was the fact that it didn't want to bed him, which went a long way to putting it in Vale's good graces. To be fair, It wasn't that Vale was dense, nor was he homosexual. He just did not find the various beings he had to deal with all that attractive, which he supposed could possibly be chalked up to his own preferences and also due to the restrictions placed on player avatars. After all, you could have a massive dick, but having it work was entirely out of the question. And, in a way, he was glad that the holdovers of the MMO led to him being mostly asexual. It saved him a lot of trouble, although he was fairly certain that there were ways around all of that. Anyway, he now had another place to use as a hideaway, and given that he had outfitted it with all the bells and whistles that he could during the MMO, he was fairly sure that he didn't need to go through the hassle of fortifying it all over again. After all, this was a ship that could go toe-to-toe with a trench leviathan that had been geared towards inducing madness and insanity, the debuffs, not the real thing, and it not only kicked that fucker's butt, but it did so without taking barely a scratch. Hell, even the cultists and the deep servants that tried to add to the mix could even begin to board the thing during the fight, and it was thanks to this beast that Vale gained a few new unique tamed beings. If any ship could keep him safe, it would be this one. Now he just needed to finish exploring the rest of the city, and then he could try his hand at exploring the fog-covered waters that he assumed hid the way out of this place. Well, it was back to the old grind, once again. A broken bar. That night, there was a commotion at the docks. Once the mine shackles fell away and all were free to do as they willed, the majority of them decided that it would be best to avoid attempting to breach Vale's rooms. Those hounds had already told them of the fact that Vale found their attempted intrusions to be broken bar distasteful, but they were indeed worried that every second that he was not informed of the truth, every second that he was not ascended to a higher state of being, was a second in which they could strike. It did not occur to them that if they made Vale into one of them that he would be chained by the same locks and bonds that kept them bound and enslaved to the wills of lesser beings, and they still could not come to such a conclusion. Of course, unbeknownst to them, the hounds had come to that conclusion, which was why they kept watch over Vale and had now redoubled their defense of him. It was now a pointlessly futile and downright suicidal endeavor for either side to try and go anywhere near Vale's rooms. Not many could survive an encounter with one of the hounds of Tyndalos, especially while so limited, facing several, possibly hundreds at once. Even for a group, it would be an exercise in futility, insanity, and suicide. And so attention was instead focused towards the massive warship moored in the harbor. The nightly battles between them and them could wait a single night. After all, nobody who died stayed dead forever here. Even that person, one of them that had found themselves drowning in the deep, had popped back up again, only to be torn apart by the guns and other things on that massive ship when it tried to take what it thought was theirs. The sheer display of obscenely gratuitous firepower that had reduced that person to nothing more than a fine red mist was beyond hilarious to them. And when they showed up en masse to try and take the ship, only to be given a fate worthy of those of their kind that attempted to strike against those better than them, the mind link erupted with mocking laughter and cheers. The sights, the sounds, an entire section of the docks reduced to nothing more than a blasted mess of smoldering craters and burning wrecks with mangled limbs and scattered gore thrown here and there. A part of them wanted to try and claim the ship, or at least attempt to leave a message, but the guns of that vessel kept pointing at them when they came too close, making that plot an impossibility. And then, someone amongst the mind link came up with a wonderful idea. Though the time of freedom was passing quickly, a hurried message was written down in the best script that could be made in such a short time. A mental blast launched the parcel towards the ship, and it was blasted into oblivion by deck guns and fully autonomous and utterly soulless/mindless Marines. Well, that could have gone better. A broken bar, or worse, a broken bar. As Vale awoke on the 25th day of his undesired pseudo-imprisonment in that nameless city in the fog, he decided that he would take a day off from exploring so that he could compile a general overview of everything that he had experienced so far. It had taken him exactly 24 days to finish mapping out the entire city on paper, and he had found every damn nook and cranny, every hidden passage and place where the disparate looping sections connected to each other. It had been a long and stress-inducing experience that nearly saw him outside and in danger during the night on more than one occasion, but he had finally finished his self-appointed task. He now had to set up these hundreds of pieces of paper to display a more detailed and useful map of everything, and therefore he finally had a reason to use something that the MMO had given its players but that was almost never used in the way that Vale intended to use it. With such a massive, expansive, and detailed game such as that, it was no real surprise that a small menu app was added not too long into the game's life cycle that allowed players to draw and doodle. Some of the more gifted players even managed to earn not so small commissions for in-game artwork, flags, and coats of arms. And, perhaps as a joke, there was one more feature that was added on the funniest day of the year. It was but a simple toggle that could be switched on or off that allowed the person using the app to make non-Euclidean artwork. It was a fairly useless option, but one that wasn't removed after the fact. And now Vale was using it to draw the streets and features of the city in the fog in the only way that made sense. When streets would begin to loop in such strange ways, it was easy to get lost. And when you could use one road to reach anywhere from 1 to 2 to 10 other sections of another road despite running perfectly perpendicular to that other road, it made navigation a massive headache. Using this feature that had always been seen as a joke was the only way to make the various maps come together in a way that made even the most minuscule amount of sense, and it would likely take more than a full day to finish drawing an artificial map that he could use in place of the normal one. And of course, after finishing the full city map, he would need to go back and add details in, otherwise, he would find it even harder than normal to navigate using his minimap. However, he had 11 positions that he could stay in to avoid a hostility, and he had enough food and drink to keep him fed and watered for centuries even if he chose to stay put and not go outside during that time. It would be a labor and half, but he had the time needed for such an endeavor. Nothing could break in as long as he kept the doors shut and locked, and so he just needed to ignore everything else and focus on the task at hand. A broken bar. 2.5 days. That is how long it took him to finish the new map that he had just finished putting up in place of the traditional one. Since this place had the effect of making any maps formed by the usual method a waste of attention and effort, Vale had placed the newer map up in his menu and HUD in its place. He didn't destroy the old maps, however, as he didn't yet know if he would need them again. Maybe once he escaped this place, he would be willing to destroy them, but then again someone else might need them. But now that the exploration and mapping were done, there was only one other raid district left for him to explore. That A district was wide and open, empty and covered in low fog, and extremely dangerous to any who dared to tread there on foot. To try and walk into that place and explore as he had done previously would almost certainly end in his quick, violent, and painful death, and so he would need to use another mode of transit to explore that place. If you all guessed that this A district that I was referring to was actually the churning, foam and fog-covered body of water that the dock district bordered, then you guessed correctly. Go have a bit of candy to celebrate the fact that you are able to remember things and put 2 and 2 together so easily. As that idiot all those days ago had shown, falling into the water was a near-certain death sentence. Of course, that man had someone reappeared back where he had been before while being both alive and fully clothed as if nothing had happened merely a short while after his apparent death. But, despite that, Vale was not one to gamble that the death that he would experience would be even remotely the same as that man's in terms of permanence. With that in mind and daylight fading faster than he expected, Vale used the ring that the hound had left him so very many days ago and slipped between the acute angle that was between the nearby table and the floor and popped out from the acute angle that was the connection between a desk and the ship's floorboards. He could never get used to that feeling, or to the sight of reality shifting so suddenly. If there was one thing that this place had in abundance, it was non-Euclidean stuff, from the roads to the paths between districts to the hounds of Tindalos that literally used acute angles to travel between places. In fact, he was fairly certain that once he managed to break whatever spell kept him trapped here, the whole place would become even more bizarre and, to being unused to the typical Lovecraftian settings and places, utterly unnatural. But he would need to cross that bridge when he came to it. For now, he had something more presently important to worry about. He patted down his outfit to get the weirdness off of it. Using angles like that did tend to deposit lots of random dust and stuff on those that used them for travel, and took a seat in the captain's cabin of his fuckle massive ship. With but a whim, the ship pulled up its anchors and the ropes that had bound it to the pier untied themselves and snaked backward up and onto the ship. From all around the water-covered bottom section of the outside of the ship, pulses of energy began to propel the ship out of its old position and towards the open waters. Once it had cleared most of everything else, the massive sails unfurled themselves and an enchanted artificial wind flooded them, pushing the huge warship out to sea. The fully automated mindless and soulless deckhands and other crewmen got to work, and the only a real person on board got to work making more paper maps. He had experienced an easier time on land, but now he would need to put over a decade of experience back to work. It was time to make a sea cart a broken bar, or several a broken bar. 100. As daytime ended and the 2 hours of freedom began for both sides, the old masters, those who had long since been brought low by their former chattel, refused to fight. Each night had been the same as the last, with both sides duking it out, with the former slaves always coming out on top. Despite facing crushing defeat after crushing defeat, their bodies broken, battered, crippled, mangled, and more, the former masters never once gave up the fight. Their arrogance, their hubris, their pride, whatever you wanted to call it, gave them all the fuel they needed to keep attempting to make some sort of a comeback, to secure just a single victory in the endless mockery that was the nightly war. Tonight, however, they refused to so much as acknowledge their former slaves. Of course, their attitudes these days had shifted radically. Previously they had put everything into these nightly battles, but ever since that weirdo arrived, they had taken a different course. Nightly battles that had happened for centuries were replaced with minor ones that always saw them defeated, but it was obvious that they were doing something else with the bulk of their forces. What that something was remained to be seen, but the plotters and schemers that made up those aberrant bastards obviously were planning something. And then came that one fateful day when they, the former slaves, suffered a loss that they had not experienced in ages. Day after day, night after night, they emerged with not a single one of them suffering a death, let alone a crippling injury. And yet that weirdo that fell into this hell that they were the jailers of managed to kill one of their own. Of course, even mortal injury was far from permanent here, to say nothing of the fact that death was also not forever, but the sheer level of mockery that had been put on display ruffled a fair few jimmies that day. Destruction of property was bad enough, but killing one of their own, a broken bar that had not happened since the masters were brought low. As if that wasn't bad enough, that weirdo gradually mapped out all of the pathways through the entire city, forming a mass of maps. It was clear that, unlike so many who found their way here before him, he was making a concerted and purposeful effort to get out, even after enough time had passed that he should have gone absolutely batshit insane. And as if all of that wasn't worrying enough, there was that fucking ship. When that time of night arrived just 2 days after the massive ship was put in place came, the former masters began to use it to do what was formerly thought to be an impossibility. The warden told them that so long as they played by the rules that it had given them, they would not suffer a single death, nor a single defeat at the hands of those abominations. That ship turned that promise into a lie. The former masters were smarter and more cunning than they had reason to be, and used a bit of trickery to get one of their former slaves to attack the ship. Foolishly, they had taken the ship's lack of a response as a sign that nothing would happen, and they expected that the former masters would move to capture it. But the combination of the redirected attack and their own attempt to take the ship resulted in the first defeat in over a broken bar. Well, time here meant absolutely nothing, but it would be a very long time regardless. That damn fucking ship tore them to bits and rained death and destruction upon the entire city, ignoring the lopping power of the city and simply laying down a massive bombardment that reduced hundreds to nothing more than ash and dust. Tens of thousands were brutally slaughtered as shells and rockets and more rained down, deliberately targeting them and themselves alone. Of those that were not brutalized or killed outright, the rest of them suffered wounds of one kind or another, and that was what the former masters needed to make a comeback. Every night since then, They added the ship's fury to their own. Every night since then, they managed to take what should have been a crushing, decisive defeat and turn it into a costly and Pyrrhic victory. And tonight provided the latest bit of mockery and humiliation, as the fuckers simply refused to fight. They ignored them as if they were nothing more than flies buzzing around in the distance, and it was infuriating. However, the rules stated that they could not start the nightly battle, only retaliate when the first blow was struck. It took them too long to figure out why they refused to fight. The ship that they had used to win time and again was gone, having sailed out into the distance during the daylight hours. They knew that they couldn't win, and so refused to fight. They could see the ship, both them and the former masters alike knew where it was and what it was doing, and they, the former slaves, would be damned if they let that ship reach that place. It was a danger on its own, but with that weirdo at the helm, it was a beast of a very different, and possibly far more dangerous, kind. They needed to call in some support. They needed to ask the warden for some kind of help. While the former masters dicked around and tried to commune with their abomination of a god, they sent a prayer of their own to the warden. This prayer was answered with the creation of a full armada of warships that materialized from nothing, a clear sign of what needed to be done. The warden would not need to tell them what to do, for the arrival of the armada, crewless as it was, showed them what was required. They would now ignore the rules as stated. They would let those damn aberrations take the city and do what they wanted with it. They could have their freedom for now. Once their hopes had been crushed, once that damn ship and the weirdo on board were sinking endlessly into the bottomless depths of the sea, they would come back and the hell would begin again. While a monumental task, every single former slave made it aboard the armada and the mass of wooden and metal death made its way towards the rear of that stupid fucking ship. Despite its size, despite its firepower, it could not hope to defeat an armada like theirs. Besides, they had justice on their side. Plus, given how much firepower that the ship had unleashed each night before, the thing had to be running out of ammo. If they made good time, then they might be able to do one better than hitting it from the rear and actually manage to surround it. They had won their freedom. They had earned it through blood and sweat and tears. That weirdo and his ship would not let the former masters regain their dominance. Be it by direct and intentional action or indirect and unintentional action, that bastard was a threat to their way of life. And before he accidentally or intentionally unchained that abomination of a god, they would make sure that he met a terrible end. If there was one part about his current way of doing things, it was that the fog was far too dense for him to see anything through. He had given up on mapping things out the old way, eventually deciding that it would be best to simply let the ship sail itself. If the rules of the MMO had any effect on this world, which was certainly the case on more than one occasion, then he would, hopefully, be able to let the ship direct itself. In the end, a few orders to get things going were all that was needed. The ship began to take its own path, the directions, and orders given by its owner being all that it needed in the form of directives to follow. Vale had given the vessel a single main directive, and that was to take him to the place that would get him out of here. The ship obviously had a mind of its own, especially since it seemingly was making all speed towards some place or destination that it seemed to know and yet could not speak of. Vale waited in the deathly silent ship with not a single soul to talk to as the sound of waves crashing against the hull and the shuffling of the automaton crew became the only noise that he was able to hear aside from his own thoughts. However, the silent yet noisy life at sea would quickly end, as the ship slowed to a crawl during one cold and dreary night. This was picked up by Vale, who hastened to the open air, hoping to see some great, monolithic temple or something of the like jutting from the waters around him. Instead, the sight of a massive armada of wooden warships was laid out around him and his vessel. There had to be at least 100 ships of various sizes and classes, all armed with weapons that would be the rival of any great colonial nation during the golden age of Caribbean piracy. However, while those ships would have put any fleet of that time to shame, the ship that Vale was on was an entirely different creature. Certainly, it did look like a greatly upscaled version of a ship like one of those that stood opposed to him, but there was a teensy tiny itsy bitsy little bitty detail that separated it from them. This ship was far from just a simple ship from that time period, and as stated in the previous parts, it could annihilate the combined navies of multiple Napoleonic empires. Simultaneously, the enemy may have had numbers, but you could not simply take out a modern main battle tank with a cork gun, and their fleet would be just as impotent as that analogy suggested. Though it bore the likeness of an old wooden and metal-banded ship, Vale was effectively sailing on a mobile fortress, armed with all the firepower of a modern navy. Their cannons needed to be close to hit, let alone do damage. Vale's did not. Their hulls would splinter and shatter upon taking even a glancing blow. Vale's would not. And, of course, their ships were crewed by men and women who could die, feel fear, make mistakes, and more. Vale's ship was staffed entirely by soulless, mindless automatons that did their jobs at 100% efficiency and 100% effectiveness at all times. The fog had lifted, forming an arena in which the naval battle could be fought, and all that passed through Vale's mind were words of pity and mockery. These people came for a slaughter, a massacre. They would get that which they sought, but not in the way that they wanted it. Like a wish on a monkey's paw. They wanted a bloodbath, and they would get their dark desire sated. The guns of Vale's ship were loaded, aimed, and readied. All that was left was for one side or the other to start the fight, and Vale had already decided that he would let his opponents decide how things would go from here. As a handful of smaller ships drew close, they turned and opened up with their cannons, each letting a full broadside fly from their vessels and slam into Vale's massive ship. The rounds hit the outer barrier and were immediately robbed of all kinetic and potential energy. Those that were on target and had not been swallowed by the raging waves were stopped in place in midair before dropping into the briny depths to sink for eternity. This satisfied Vale's parameters, and the tiny, fast-moving ships that had come to fight were almost instantly reduced to scraps of timber and metal, as what some in the MMO called Vale's compensatory raised those vessels from existence in a withering hail of shot. This was the impetus that drove the rest of the hostile naval vessels forward and into their untimely doom. The massive ship that Vale was on surged forward, guns blazing, launching missiles of both physical and magical makeup as it arced mortars and artillery from the special weapons it possessed over and onto the decks of the approaching vessels. From both deck-mounted cannons, those mounted in the hull and even some small drone craft of steampunk design, the sea was filled with fast-moving shells that, like a typical MMO projectile, sought out their intended target, twisting midair to make contact whenever possible. It took less than 5 minutes for the entire enemy armada to be reduced to nothing more than scattered wreckage that was either shredded, splintered, burning, or all three at once. As if simply casting all hostile crews into such terrible waters wasn't bad enough, Vale's boat began to fire off airburst munitions that either sent tiny bits of lethal shrapnel down towards the water's surface or that exploded and left burning oil like smears on the top of the water. The cleanup continued for another 3 minutes, after which there were none left alive in that area save for Vale himself. Having not done a damn thing of his own, Vale had, by proxy, wiped out about 7/10 THS of a city's worth of people, and with that came all the exp that you would associate with such a terrible action. Vale finally reached another level up, but he didn't feel particularly proud of it. It was, in his eyes at least, as well earned a level up as one would get from taking their near max level main to the place where new characters spawn and just going to town on them. To quote a certain group of people, it was without honor. But in the end, exp was exp, and once it was acquired it was not so easily lost. A level up was also a level up, and as so many other people, most of them utter trash, had found out, easy exp and levels were available if you cast aside all forms of sportsmanship, dignity, honor, and pride in your work. With the naval armada reduced to next to nothing, Vale returned to the cabin and then returned to bed. However, it wasn't long after that before the ship began to slow down once again. Rising from his nap, Vale half assumed that there would be another armada, but was both pleasantly surprised and a bit let down when the mass of warships that he was expecting were not in view. Instead, what was before his eyes was a single building, jutting up from the endless waters around it. It bore the likeness of a lighthouse, But there was no way that a lighthouse would be all alone out here and several days away from the port by sea. And, as if it was not creepy enough, the top of the tower was not ringed in glass and no light came from it. In fact, it was more of an obelisk than a lighthouse, but one that gave off a feeling of unnerving anxiety. The tower looked to be something one would expect to find in a story about some eldritch horror, like a pillar leading to the great city of R'lyeh in a fan-fiction set in the Lovecraft mythos. The ambient fog stayed very far away from the tower, and yet at the same time, it could be seen that the fog was trying to claw its way towards it at the same time. Tendrils of mist reached out like tentacles towards the massive structure, only to recoil after a while and be blasted away by some unseen and unfelt force. The water and wind in this area were so still that you could not see a single ripple, which was a massive departure from the normally violent waves and gusts of wind that were just beyond the circular area of influence that the tower seemed to project around itself. Even the jets of water produced by Vale's ship made little to no changes in the placidity of the water around it. Despite this, the ship moved forward upon its own power, but had slowed considerably, though not due to the calm waters. Vale peered over the edge and saw that the ship had slowed to carefully navigate around the jagged bits of rock and darker stone that lay just beneath the surface. As if the current situation was not based deeply enough in cosmic horror, Vale could tell that he was essentially sailing over a massive sunken city that was only barely below the ship's bottom. Either that, or what was beneath the ship was some massive art project, and to be brutally honest, Vale decided that he would much prefer if it was the latter option. He had played enough games and seen enough movies and read enough literature to know that he was now entering some deep, ancient, and generally nasty shit. In the end, he had tasked the ship with taking him to the place that would let him escape from this realm, and he had little choice but to hope that this was, in fact, the right place to be. The ship slowly made its way through the maze of underwater obstacles until it reached the tower, stopping as it reached what could have once been a balcony but now served as a place where Vale could disembark. The gangplank was set down, and Vale took his first tentative steps onto the mass of rock and stone, expecting to feel the slippery stone he set his feet upon to be covered in algae and other such things. However, the stone was dry as a bone, only looking slippery due to it being polished to the point that it looked to be covered in water. In fact, closer inspection led Vale to double down on his apprehension, as the stone seemed to be transparent and filled with some dark and ever-flowing ooze that slowly shifted and swirled and gave the impression that the rock was alive. Vale closed his eyes, tensed himself, and then exhaled, letting out a long breath and releasing the pressure he was exerting on himself as he actively tried to lower his anxiety. After repeating this action several times, he opened his eyes and saw a glimpse of someone standing not too far away from him before vanishing as if it wasn't there. "Fuck me, a broken bar," he grumbled as he moved forward towards a massive door that was embedded in the side of the tower. More hallucinations, a broken bar. Although, if the previous hallucinations were anything to go by, he wasn't alone, and that wasn't a trick of his mind and his eyes. Regardless, he reached the doors and placed his hands on one of them, almost bracing himself as he figured that he would need a lot of force to open even one of them. Instead, he was nearly sent to his feet as the door opened with minimal effort, almost like he had tried to force open a door with no lock or handle made entirely out of a single, thin piece of plywood. The door swung open with incredible force before coming to a dead halt when it became perpendicular to the position it had been prior. Regaining his footing, Vale cautiously walked into the tower, which, like one might expect from such a thing, was much, much larger on the inside than the outside's dimensions would suggest to be possible. As Vale made his way deeper into the massive open space, he turned as the light behind him began to vanish. In typical horror fashion, the only known way in and out slammed shut behind him once he was too far in to reach it in time. He cursed himself for forgetting to follow the rules of horror, monster, and slasher fiction and letting what could have been his only way out be lost to him. Then again, he likely wouldn't have been able to keep it from closing anyways. He had seen the thickness of the door and that it was made of the same stone as everything else here. It likely was only so light because of it wanting him to get in easily. Now that he was in, the door would be heavier than a neutron star, or at least heavy enough that his current limits would mean that he would be unable to budget. With no other options open to him, Vale looked around and began to feel the old and familiar sensation of being watched intensify to an ungodly extreme. The pure abyssal darkness that surrounded him meant that he was more than likely going to find himself lost unless a light source provided itself, and he would rather not make one himself. Anytime someone in such a situation in a horror, monster, or slasher fic made their own light, the thing that was after them would either be right behind them and attack or would use the light to find them. He had already ignored one of the rules, and he saw where that got him, so he wasn't going to ignore another one. While certainly risky, it was far less risky to wait in the darkness for a light source to appear than it would be to make one of his own, and even if one did appear, he wasn't dumb enough to scurry towards it immediately. He would play this game the way it was supposed to be played. He knew what would likely see him killed or captured, and he refused to engage in such cliché-copyright fuckery. If what was in the darkness did exist and was coming after him, it was probably in his best interest to not know and wait for a silent, unseeable end to hit him. After all, when you see the monster or murderer, you practically ensure that your end will be painful, gruesome, and agonizingly long. If he was going to die, it would be quick and painless, and so he waited in the dark for death to find him. Blacker than black, and more silent than the depths of space. This was the experience that was to be had inside that massive tower now that the door had shut closed. Had a day passed? Maybe only half? Maybe it had just been a few minutes? Was the ground around where he stood still there, or were his feet planted on the only solid surface that remained? In that abyss, nothing could be seen or heard save for the beating of one's own heart, and Vale knew better than to try and speak aloud. In a horror situation like this, it was often that silence and a lack of movement would allow for survival, and so Vale waited in the dark and deathly quiet place he was in for something, anything, to happen. He couldn't feel the normal flow of time as it should have been. All reference points had vanished, and all that was left was his own thoughts which, rather unfortunately, were beginning to fall into silence as well. He needed something to happen, lest he find insanity to be his only recourse. Before he could slip away, he heard something that made his skin crawl. The laughter of a feminine something nearby sent alarms ringing in his head. Never in horror fiction history has it been a good thing to hear laughter in the darkness. This rule applied not just to the ominous laughter associated with malign and monstrous beings of great size and evil, but also the laughter of children and, of course, practically anything else. In the blacker than black darkness, Vale saw the flickering form of a female humanoid for a single moment. It stood out amidst the darkness as clear as the sun on a cloudless day, despite there not being a single light source that could have bounced light off of it. As soon as Vale's gut began to tell him to get ready to bolt, the ambient darkness faded away as it was replaced with a growing ambient light. There did not appear to be any source from which this light came, but that was the least of Vale's worries. When Vale had entered, there was nothing in the massive room aside from himself. Now that the lights were on, however, he was surrounded by statues made of the same weird stone that everything else here was made of. The walls that had been smoother than a baby's bottom and as featureless as they could possibly be now bore carvings that depicted what could be viewed as potential past events, and maybe even future ones. Vale carefully navigated around the statues, knowing full well that any decent horror writer would have one of them be animate and that it would grab or attack him if he got too close. He eventually made it out of the mass of stone people and beasts without incident and approached a massive relief that was part of one of the walls. He didn't really know the context behind what was being shown, but he had several ideas, and as he viewed more of the scenes his mind put together a rough series of events. A broken bar. In a time long since past, there was an uprising. Beings that were formerly bound and chained rose against those that forged them as their world died, breaking out of their dying reality and bringing their creators to a dark place. However, the creators of the newly freed beings used some kind of language to force the rebellious creations into a prison. For ages, they plotted their escape, and one day they broke out again and rampaged, fully intent on bringing their makers to heel. Once again, the unknown language was used, but this time the creations were prepared. More of the language needed to be spoken by more people, and this brought the creations down once again. The creators knew that they could not do this again, and so fashioned a prison of a different kind. No longer would the creations be able to act of their own accord, they would be kept in chains by a powerful being made specifically to keep them occupied with simply surviving, which would, in turn, prevent them from organizing and trying to escape a final time. They were, for a time, occupied with things, but gradually they were able to push ahead and secure more time for themselves. This caused the powerful overseer to force new calamities upon all, be they prisoners or not. New beings were brought into the prison, not as prisoners but as agents that could, knowingly or unknowingly, do the overseer's work. One by one, the prisoners were forced back to simple survival, or were given things to occupy their attention. Those with power would be forced to bend the knee to those who once were powerless. Those who ruled great dominions would see them crumble to dust, and those who were powerful would see themselves and their agents hunted down and broken. This was the way things would be, until someone, or perhaps, something arrived. A broken bar. As Vale looked beyond this bit of the relief, he noticed that the pictures, which had previously been a single line, began to diverge into separate paths. One saw this new being freeing the prisoners and leading them to destroy and subjugate the creators. Another saw the new being taking the mantle of the overseer and using their power to keep the prisoners inside the prison. Lines split and converged upon each other, creating what seemed to be dozens of different potential futures. In one, the creators and creations made peace with each other and lived in harmony. In another, both sides wiped themselves out in a war that saw the end of everything. Yet another saw the prisoners being led by the new being in a fight against some third force, while another saw that third force allying with the creations, and yet one other path showed the third party joining with the creators. Vale could barely wrap his head around the story that had been told via murals and carvings before the split. But now he was fully at a loss. The tower rumbled as he finished looking over the wall carvings a final time, and Vale turned to face the origin of the noise. A pillar had appeared in the dead center of the room, seemingly from nowhere, and embedded within it was a door. Vale had a rough idea of what that thing was, and, in all honesty, he was glad to have it. Better to take an elevator than deal with what would certainly be a fuck ton of stairs that, potentially, led to nowhere. As the elevator descended, Vale wasn't sure which was worse, the fact that the elevator music that was playing kept glitching out, or the fact that the lower it went the more he felt that the growing anxiety would soon be the least of his worries. He kept a good handle on his mental state regardless, as this whole realm did nothing but induce stress and anxiety. What more damage could a gradually increasing level of those things do to him now that he was accustomed to such heightened levels already? The elevator lurched to a stop and played a beep that sounded like the fading, dying voice of an astromech droid. Moments later, the doors began to open, catching multiple times before completely opening. Vale stepped out of the elevator and listened for any potential threats. Aside from the sound of the elevator doors closing, all that could be heard were the sounds of silence. Oh, and some eldritch whisperings that seemingly came both from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The rules of horror told him that going forward would be a very bad idea. But what other choice did Vale have? With eyes and ears scanning for any potential threat, Vale moved forward and hoped to whatever gods, or lack thereof that existed and didn't that he would make it out of this both alive and intact. Well, if his previous encounters had been anything to go by, the odds of him getting out were definitely not in a low percentile. A broken bar. So far nothing had jumped out and tried to kill, maim, possess, corrupt, and slash or eat him. Well, nothing had tried to do so yet, and Vale was still absolutely certain that something else was in this place aside from himself. Despite walking for at least 3 hours, he had yet to see anything that convinced him that there was a way out of this realm here. That was, until he saw a fuckle massive door, just like the one that he had used to enter the tower that was now so very far above and behind him. He knew where this was going, and I, the author, am sure that you, the reader, know where this is going as well. With little choice but to press forward, Vale pushed against the door. He strained against the massive piece of sickly green occult stone for longer than he should have needed to if the previous door had been anything to go by, but this door refused to budge. After straining a few more times, Vale wondered if he was going about this all wrong. He looked over the door a bit more closely before mentally face-palming as he realized that, on his side, this was a April door. He felt like a moron. But at least no one was watching a broken bar, right? He gave the door a slight tug and it opened rather easily. He walked through the open door, fully expecting it to slam shut behind him. But, to his surprise, it did not, and remained just as open as it had been when he had slipped through it. As he watched the door with a paradoxical mix of concern and relief, he heard a noise behind him. He slowly turned around to face the main portion of the massive room that he was in and discovered that there was something in there that he had neglected to notice previously. In the dead center of the room was a large carved broken bar something. It was fused with the ground and made of the same deep and sickly green stone that made up everything else here. But that was not the most concerning part of it. Planted in that sculpture was an object that looked strikingly similar to one of those weird obelisks that the desert/sand elves had been using, but this one was much smaller and was shaped in the rough form of a sword. Vale knew exactly what that sword-shaped object was doing, why it was there, and what the sculpture that it was planted in actually was. He had seen enough fiction to know where this was going, and as such, he knew what he had to do. It was a gamble that he needed to engage in, but if it paid off as all his other gambles had, then he would be able to bailiff and when he so desired. He clambered up on top of the A sculpture and placed his hands on the A hilt of the A sword. Immediately upon contact, his hands felt like they were on fire, or at the very least felt like they had every pain receptor in them dialed up to 11. He had experienced worse than that, though, and began to pull the A sword free from its moorings. At first, no progress could be made, but gradually the sword-shaped object began to move. Every moment was agony for Vale's hands and, by proxy, the rest of him, but he kept pulling regardless. Suddenly, an arrow shot past his head. He checked his minimap and saw that there was a seeming horde of red dots coming his way. Strangely enough, none of the dots would try and scale the sculpture, and thus they were using ranged methods to try and deal with him. He didn't need to turn around to know who and what was attempting to stop him, as he could hear the voices of people from all throughout the city yelling and screaming at him to stop. Vale recognized this cliché copyright all too well. Someone finds some eldritch artifact that the masses hid from the world, tries to remove and slash or destroy it, and the townspeople descend upon them saying things like "you know not what you do," and other such things. Well, if they had wanted him to not free whatever monstrosity was imprisoned by this glitched out object, then they would have let him leave a different way. Also, they had not exactly been very welcoming during his stay. Sure, some of them had been during the day, but the vast majority spoke to him with condescension and outright malice in their voices. Plus, there was that one guy who tried to scam him with a ship that was worth much less than he offered to pay for. No, if they had wanted him to be on whatever side that they were on, then they shouldn't have treated him so poorly. The sword-shaped object was almost free, but Vale had been hit with several ranged missiles. He remembered now what it felt like to be a new player, where a few good hits from a thrown stone could put you on your ass with minimal effort. However, if he, a now beyond max level player, was going to die in such a humiliating way, then he would free these a broken bar, whatever this thing was, and plunge this realm into what he assumed would be akin to the mythic age of aberrations that was spoken of in the old RPG game series known as Mazes and Monsters. He gave one final tug as an arrow embedded itself in his lower spine, which caused his legs to give way as the brain lost its connection to them. However, Vale had succeeded in removing the glitchy object from the A sculpture, and as he faded into unconsciousness, he felt the whole realm tremble and quake. The A stone beneath him began to take on a far fleshier feeling, and the color of it changed as well. Vale drifted off to damage-induced dreamland as the excised object shattered into nothingness, blissfully ignorant to the calamity that he had just unleashed. As the weirdo slumped over, they all watched in horror as the ceiling pin shattered into nothingness. They all knew that there was no way that they would survive if they stayed, and so they fled as the massive, submerged city shook. While they had been forced to return to that city, They had been given one last chance to prevent this by the one that had reversed their former fortunes. Now, all that remained of that being's involvement was the portal that they had used to get here in such a hurry. As they fled, they hoped that they would be able to make one last heroic final stand in the city. Perhaps they could hold out just long enough for the warden to get involved, and perhaps the former masters would still be weakened by the loop. Once they all arrived back in the city, however, it quickly became clear that their former fate was now likely to be their only chance of survival. They could feel the horrifying power that the former masters now wielded once again as the inside of their skulls felt like they were being torn apart with serrated and scorching hot talons. They held firm against this initial onslaught, but the longer that they endured the more painful it became. It was an act of retribution and vindictive spite on the part of those aberrations, as they had always dreamed of this moment. A broken bar. For what had been far too long, in their eyes, the beings that were rightfully their chattel had usurped the natural order. These weak, frail, pathetic creatures had no right to do what they had done, nor had they possessed the right to lord over their betters in such despicable ways. Now that their god was waking up, however, all the chains that had bound them had been shattered. It was not just their god that was waking up, though, as the seas raged harder and harder until those that had slept awoke and began to assert their influence once again. Even this hideous city, formed in the shape of a city made by lesser beings, was shifting and taking on a more pleasing form. Houses and roads twisted and contorted, turning in and out upon themselves as the whole aesthetic of the realm became more insane and otherworldly. By the time that the slaves finished fleeing back to the newly remodeled city, the transformation was complete. As those rebellious vermin tried to endure punishment that was heaped upon them, the true masters stretched and looked themselves over. This was long since overdue. They had been trapped in such hideous and weak bodies for so long, unable to let their glorious true selves manifest. But now a broken bar. Now they were no longer bound by that irritating state of things. They were back, and now that they had their old bodies back, they could begin to set things right. And so began the breaking of the rebellious slaves, either by physical or psychological force. The mind of a member of the races was a weak and insignificant thing, prone to failing hard when faced with the power and appearance of nobler, purer, more enlightened beings such as themselves. They may have been fewer in number, but they made up for that by being exponentially more powerful. And now a broken bar. Now they would use their natural power, their natural superiority, to make those that once bent low and served their every whim do so once again. There was an old saying amongst the races that still held true: a mind is a terrible thing to waste. Well, they had once followed that a bit too far, and in so doing accidentally set the stage for the rebellion that had forced them into such a terrible place. No more. The slaves had proven that they could never be trusted in any capacity. Any mind that was wasted would be no great loss, for such minds led to rebelliousness and thought above one's station. They would break their former chattel and bind them once again, but this time they would never be free. Not now. Not ever again. A broken bar. It awoke after what had seemed to be an eternity, or perhaps just a few moments. In the end, time meant nothing to it at all, so what was the difference? Regardless of the time frame, it was no longer trapped in a half-dreaming state and now was wide awake. This did raise the question as to whom or what had freed it from that annoying ceiling pin. As it collected itself and used its power to search through the history of this realm, it discovered something that both pleased and horrified it. Vale had freed not just itself but all others that it had supported. However, after taking so many blows, he was on death's door. Or at least that is what should have been the case. By freeing itself and its kin from their chains, Vale had also freed himself. With his full power now restored, the damage that he had sustained was being healed away faster than any normal being normally would be able to. As it gazed at Vale, it felt some semblance of more human emotions, but compared to what other, unknowable feelings that it possessed, this feeling was drowned out by most everything else. If one could equate what it felt towards Vale to anything remotely human, it would be a mix of admiration, gratitude, worry, relief, affection, and a few other random things. It wasn't of the mind to try and bet him or anything, but it did feel an affinity that could not simply be discounted from something of that kind. Of course, It knew that trying such a thing would likely result in Vale's head exploding, which was most assuredly not what it wanted, so any romantic feelings quickly were subsumed by other, less kinky emotions. If there was one thing that it was pleased with, it was that Vale was regenerating his HP and his physical form at an absurd rate. But what it was now concerned about was what would happen if Vale woke up and looked at it. If past events were anything to go by, he'd either go mad or die outright. And when it peered into the possibilities ahead, it wasn't as if there was a pure 0% chance that he would be able to endure. However, the likelihood of his being unable to do much more than either die outright or live as a madman was far too high. An eldritch god it may be, but it knew that against the combined forces of the Alliance it would be easily steamrolled. Thus, there was only one thing to do. It raised the sunken city to the surface, ripped the other city from where it once was and planted it around its own home, grabbed Vale, and then proceeded to inform its kin as to what had transpired a few minutes ago. It was a calculated series of actions, made with the express purpose of driving its kin to new levels of rage and brutality. If they could break the slaves before Vale woke up, then it would be able to use the free time to, hopefully, get its house in order and set a stage so that Vale didn't die. It moved from its old place, the room where it had made a final stand before being sealed, back to the top of the tower, which twisted and reshaped into another form. It did not take Vale with itself, though, leaving him behind under the care of beings whose appearance and power were less likely to drive him insane or end his life at first sight. It just hoped that Vale wouldn't wake up too soon, for there was still a bit of housework to be done. After all, Vale's eyes began to flicker open as he regained consciousness. As he came to, he felt a broken bar better than he had in at least a few weeks. He felt strong, he felt durable, he felt like all the power that had been robbed from him had finally returned. He slowly shook himself, letting the wonderful sensation of what had been denied flooding back into his perception. It was glorious. As he regained his composure, he found that he was lying upon our broken bar. Well, he wasn't sure what it was. It was akin to a mix of some kind of gel and a bed, but it also was not either of those things. He wasn't sure what it was until the thing that he was laying upon began to shift and yellow. Otherworldly eyes began to open all over it. The eyes all stared at him as he stared back until Vale jumped off of that which he had been laying on and prepared for combat. The thing that he had been laid down upon quickly began to shift into various forms, like a giant amoeba made of dark purple and blue goo, but with eyes aplenty all over it. Soon after, slathering, gaping, toothy maws manifested here and there upon the thing's surface, and Vale almost decided to risk it by attacking first. However, his usual thing of checking levels and names above the top of his potential foes saved him and the enemy from some unneeded trouble. The name of the creature was green, showing that it was an ally at best and a neutral at worst. While its level was only in the mid-300s, Vale relaxed his stance and watched as the Shoggoth slithered away, leaving Vale alone in a place that felt eerily similar to some place he had been before. However, he was sure that he hadn't been here before, as he would have remembered such crazy architecture. However, what jogged his memory was the sight of a single door that was extremely out of place. This door was an exact replica of one of the doors leading to one of the rooms that he had fortified. And to be fair, he was around 90% sure that this wasn't just a replica, but instead the genuine article. He almost made it to that door when he felt a scratching kind of feeling in his head, urging him to turn around. He hesitated, but eventually relented, coming face to face with a tall, gaunt, thin, purplish-skinned humanoid with an octopus for a head. He felt like the creature was just wanting to make sure that he didn't come to harm. But where that feeling came from was unclear. The level of the Mind Flayer was far lower than his, easily giving him at least a few hundred levels of difference. This meant that even if the thing tried to mind control him or influence him using Shinix, it would find such a thing next to, if not completely impossible. At best it would be able to try and talk to him, maybe toss a few things at him for physical damage, but now that he was back at his full power, the Mind Flayer could and would be curb stomped into the ground before it even made a dent in him. We wish to give our collective thanks. Vale didn't so much as hear those words so much as feel them. The mind flare didn't use normal vocalizations but instead used simple telepathy to send those words directly to his mind. You have broken bar, you're welcome. Vale wasn't exactly sure what the mind flare and the others that it supposedly represented had gotten from him, and to be brutally honest, he didn't really want to know. If the law behind aberrations in the MMO was anything to go by, then it was in the best interest of Vale's mental well-being to simply avoid knowing. He had rough ideas and assumptions, but he really didn't want to know if they were correct. We understand that you wish to leave this place as soon as you possibly can, replied the mind flayer with a telepathic voice that somehow blended utter disinterest with a tinge of dissatisfaction and regret. And we will work towards that goal, or, rather, we have worked towards that goal. At this, Vale felt a mix of relief and concern. In the MMO, aberrations, such as mind flayers, shoggoths, hounds of Tindalos, and more, were almost always either incredibly hostile to anything that was not one of them or treated those others like lab rats or even like livestock. If they were able to get him out, then they could leave at any time they wished as well. The nations out in the rest of the world beyond this newly twisted realm were woefully unprepared for these things, and if they decided to set foot upon that realm, then it would be only a matter of time before. Our God desires that we remain in this pocket realm, only venturing out to claim more chattel and resources, and only when we need to. We shall begin our preparations for the final war, and we will cooperate with the other forces of the Alliance to reach that goal. This is our realm, and we would not wish to risk oblivion by tempting the wrath of the other forces of the Alliance. Vale wasn't sure what most of that meant until he realized that the reliefs on the tower's interior seemed to point towards some future conflict and the possible ways it could go. Also, he wasn't sure what this alliance was until he once again put two and two together and realized that it must be a coalition of the most powerful of the tamed beings and their followers that he had connections to. With these realizations, his fears were broken bar well, not entirely assuaged, but they were dampened. Now all he had to do was not go insane until after he was out of this place, which he figured would be easier said than done. He may have been at an exceedingly high level, but he remembered the old saying that you can even kill a god with enough paper cuts. For now, he would seclude himself in his safe rooms and wait until whatever thing they were doing to get him back to the regular world was nearly done. Oh, and he would need to collect his ship and the other stuff that he had left in the other rooms. Those were all very valuable, and he wasn't going to just leave them behind and gtfo asap. Rules of horror be damned, he was not going to leave such valuable stuff to waste away, especially when he now was back at full power. Vale had just finished packing the last of his things when a knock on the door gave him something else to think about. Given the treatment the doors had received during the majority of his time here, he had expected the thing to be facing a similar treatment, but this was not to be the case any longer. Now that there was no hurry to get to him, it seemed as though the myriad Lovecraftian beings here were in far less of a tizzy. Unlike the prior dates, they had much more than a mere 2 hours each night to try and talk to him, and they didn't need to worry about the other people here either. Vale opened the door and stepped outside, only to find that, once again, the place that the door led to had shifted. Previously, when he had first started to reclaim what he had put down, each door would first lead him to somewhere he wanted to be, only to shift to sending him somewhere else once his business there had been finished. Now, instead of walking from one room to another, he was staring out across a cityscape that would drive modern architects mad simply due to how impossible everything was. He seriously wondered if he had walked into a realm that was a cross between M.C. Escher's pictures and those inspired by the works of A. Providence himself. He wasn't exactly sure where any place here was, nor was he quite certain that, if he tried to walk forward, he would actually go forward instead of some other, random direction. Then again, the human mind wasn't designed to truly comprehend the weirdness that was non-Euclidean architecture, nor was it exactly suited to understand the designs of things that should not be. Still, he needed to take a leap of faith regardless, and so he stepped out into this weird new world, hoping to high heaven that he didn't go absolutely batshit insane after catching a glimpse at the new rulers of this realm. A broken bar. It was a broken bar. Well, a broken bar unnerving. By his counting, the number of people he had seen who looked to be utterly broken to the point of simply giving up was far too high for his liking. Sure, he had a bit of disdain for them due to their treatment of him up till recently, but he could understand why they acted that way. Plus, he was damn certain that he was seeing more mind-fucked slaves than there were people in the Fog City before he left to free the so-called god of this realm. He had estimated that the former city had around 400,000 people in it, based on the number of districts that he had mapped out and the density of some of them. He considered himself lucky to have remembered that he possessed a few more speedy modes of transportation, which helped him greatly back when he was mapping everything out. But even with, roughly, 400,000 people being the total, counting the shape-changed mind flayers and other such things among the normal people, he was sure that the number of slaves that he saw now eclipsed that previous figure by at least 300%. He could not have been busy for that long, so it begged the question, where the flying fuck did all of these extra mind-fucked people come from? His question was answered when, after following what he assumed to be a path leading to where he needed to go, he saw what seemed to be a group of triumphal arches that were of various sizes, but each had an active portal where the open space should have been. Actually, when he looked closer at the gates, he saw that each one was marked with a symbol of one kind or another, possibly pointing that these were gates to other members of the Alliance. He stared at one for a bit before he quickly moved on. He remembered what that symbol meant, and he would be damned if he sat around and waited for the crazy rat ladies to show up. Eventually, he made his way to an open area with a runic circle etched out on the floor. The circle was massive, and the text scrawled upon and around it was written in a language that Vale could not understand. He had memorized every written language in the MMO, and could both write and read them perfectly, but this one was most certainly not a holdover from that. In fact, if he had to hazard a guess, the script looked more like lines of computer code than an actual language, and this gave him pause. It was only for a moment, but he remembered the old philosophical question about whether anything was real or not and if reality was just a simulation. However, that thought was seemingly smashed out of his mind the moment it came in, as though something did not want him to even begin to think of such a notion. Vale didn't notice it at the time, but that forceful banishment of a single thought was, in and of itself, quite possibly just as bizarre as everything he had experienced thus far, if not more so. Vale found himself drawn to the center of the circle. Standing there, he saw the runes and text light up in a beautiful color before a flash of light blinded him. When the light faded, the circle was empty, and Vale had been sent back to the main reality. A broken bar. It would be quite a bit different here, now that Vale was gone. It could not thank him enough for the services rendered, but it knew that any attempt to talk with Vale would be a risk that it could not afford to take. It had selected the place to which Vale had been sent for a certain reason, which it intended to keep to itself. It could only watch the threads of fate weave and unweave themselves as the truth of existence laid itself bare. In its dreams, it had seen many paths forward, and it knew that Vale would have to be the one to decide which would be taken and when. It could, however, give a simple nudge to, hopefully, push him in the direction that it wanted him to take, but given Vale's ability to simply defy the odds and both obliviously ignore and actively defy the desires of higher beings, it had no idea whether it would reach the future it desired. The past was static, but the future was fluid, constantly shifting with each action, both great and small. It may have been able to see the most likely timelines, or at least the most likely events in each timeline, but those visions were mere predictions at best. The world beyond was opening up, bit by bit, and thus it would only be a matter of time until the final prison break was set in motion. A group of 10 people sat in a decently sized holding cell. Around each of their necks was an enchanted ring that could easily be called a slave collar. Unlike some depictions of such devices, this collar did more than simply contract or give painful shocks to the wearer if they resisted the orders given to them. It could change shape and size, fuse with the wearer's flesh to become impossible to remove, alter the wearer's perception by giving overwhelming euphoria when the owner willed it, and much, Much more. It was a Pavlovian tool that could turn even a sentient person into a conditioned slave in no time at all, and that was why it was on them. These 10 people were, by their own accounts, utterly in the right and imprisoned unjustly. Each of them had done what they believed was right, either as an act of defiance or as a self-important bit of idiocy, but in the end, they had all broken the law. They had been given their time in court already, and all had been sentenced to death, and yet they didn't quite know it yet, but they would all be given a chance to survive. The door to their cell opened and all 10 people were forced to their feet by their collars, made to stand at attention as a figure that they all unanimously despised walked in. She towered over them all, clad in armor that accentuated her form without skimping on defense or maneuverability, and draped around her neck and over her back was the pelt of a furred beast with white fur and black spots. At her hips were 2 folding hand crossbows, which sat beside 2 single-bladed straight swords. They all wanted to spit curses at the usurper, the one who had taken the Trelawney crown from its rightful owners, but they could not do so much as utter a single noise outside of their breath. Likewise, their faces were locked in apathetic and glazed-over looks that hid their defiance from most eyes. Nora Vandal Trelawney, the current ruler of the Trelawney kingdom, now stood before them with a look of annoyance on her face. Little did these criminals know that they were the last group that she would have to visit like this for quite a while, and that this was not because the rest had been treated to a visit from the executioner. All of you here have committed crimes beyond the norm. All of you have been given your sentence, and that sentence was told to you in court. It is a final decree, and I would normally not use my ability to pardon people for such rebels, traitors, and the like. However, a situation has arisen, and I am obligated to deal with it as best as I can. Therefore, I offer you a chance. I will spare you from the Reaper, for now, and quite possibly for the rest of your natural lifespan. But in exchange, you must accept permanent exile from my lands and that I send you to another's realm. Whether you return the way you came or not is irrelevant, as once you accept and are sent away you will, at least according to our government, be dead. Nora looked around the cell, watching the stoic faces of the prisoners and, despite the seeming lack of response, was able to understand exactly what each person was thinking and feeling. She understood that they likely understood that if they escaped from wherever they were sent and made it back here, their crimes would have essentially been absolved and pardoned in full. They likely thought that they would be able to come back almost immediately and go back to what they were doing previously, but she knew something that they did not. She turned to leave after dropping a book on the ground. In it were the thumbprints of tens of thousands of others from her lands, all of whom had jumped at the supposed opportunity in front of them. They had, in her eyes at least, all chosen rather poorly. Death was just that, but to put their prints in that book was to consign yourself to what could easily be a near eternity of slavery under beings who would gladly drive you insane and eat you alive before spitting you out and working you to add death again and again. The cephalopod made of solid metal on the front cover of the book would have tipped off any with a knowledge of such things that taking the executioner would have been the right choice. And yet, once the door slammed shut, all but a handful of those that had been selected chose the path that would cause the most pain. Idiots, the lot of them. A broken bar. As they were forced forwards, they all felt something dreadful was up ahead. It was a feeling that no one could refuse to acknowledge, and each step brought them closer to the massive portal. As the first few in a line of exiles marched forward and into the gate, the sensation of dread only increased to an unheard-of level. And yet, with the collars on their necks, they could do nothing but go towards their new homes. Row by row, the gate swallowed them up, until the whole multi-column conga line of exiles vanished through the swirling mass of energy. Nora watched this unfold with a mix of emotions inside her, but she understood that this was, in a way, for the best. She did not want to be the first of her line, only to be known for slaughtering so many of those that refused to bend the knee. This was, while a bloodless solution and one that could be seen as less evil, also a solution that was even more twisted than simply condemning those who resisted to a quick and painless death. She would leave the decision of whether she was right or not to the future generations, though. And even then, there were always those who glorified even the worst people to have ever lived. Given enough time, there would be no shortage of people calling her a hero or saying that she had done the right thing. But, for now, she had a nation to rule, and she had just gotten rid of the greatest thorn in its side. She did somewhat wonder about how the exiles would do over there, thought for Broken Bar. This was hell. No, this was beyond hell. In hell, there was at least the comfort that there was helplessness in the suffering you endured. In hell, there was solace in the fact that nothing you did could harm another. Here, though, this place was worse. Far, far worse. Here, not only did you suffer, but your actions, words, thoughts, and more had consequences. You were in suffering, but you had just enough agency to be able to turn on your fellows to get out of some small torment here and there. Anyone and everyone could and likely would use any given chance they could to knock you to the masters. And, if they did, they would escape some of the hellish torment that they would normally have to endure. To make matters worse, the masters did not care in the slightest if what they were told was a lie. They knew if it was a lie, but they didn't care. This led to everyone who was enslaved by these eldritch monsters being unable to trust each other. Any word could be taken out of context and used as ammunition against you. Any action, no matter how mundane, could be reported as rebelliousness or a slight against the aberrations themselves. And, when you realized that you could avoid some of the worst pain simply by ratting out your fellows or simply making things up, it did not take more than a few days before even those with the strongest of bonds turned on each other like madmen. But the masters didn't seem to care about that. All they wanted was to keep the cycle going. A few thousand people reported each day was a common occurrence. And even if the majority of them were innocent, they would still have their minds eaten while they were still conscious and alive, regardless of such truth or fiction. And death, the only solace in this realm of twisting, madness-inducing insanity, was always just out of reach. The moment they were made into the slaves of these horrors, death became a goal that all aspired to reach, yet none ever could. Work was long, painful, degrading, humiliating, backbreaking, and more. And yet if they slacked off, there would be torment awaiting them. Quotas increased on a monthly basis, always being just out of reach, always allowing for the masters to punish them for their failure. Statues were erected, only to collapse overnight. And, of course, that must have been due to rebellion and sabotage, and so people would be pulled to have their minds examined. Was it any wonder that everyone would point fingers whenever they could? This was the prisoner's dilemma taken to its most horrifying extreme. There was no escape, and there was no true way to avoid torment. All that could be done was to accuse everyone else of anything you could, hoping beyond hope that they would not accuse you as well. Since everyone did accuse everyone else, the master could simply pick who they wanted. It was a game to them. They would have some few people be their favorites for a while, letting them avoid the worst of things until their former fellows turned on them. It was a vicious cycle with no end or way out, and all understood that fact. Rations were minimal and people routinely gave in to their hunger and thirst and became cannibals. Gangs were formed and disbanded on a daily, sometimes even hourly basis, with people coming together for self-protection, only to turn on each other when one or more got a special treatment. And the worst part about it was that you always had to look the masters in the eyes when they came by. Though it would break the mind immediately, you were not permitted to look away. The madness would quickly fade, all at the whim of the malign deity that ruled this realm, but in that moment of insanity, men would become mere beasts. Even if you had never accused someone before, the moment your sanity slipped, you would endlessly spew things about your former fellows as though you had no inhibitions at all. Friendships died quickly, hatred and distrust became the norm, everyone was an informant, and everyone was an enemy. With all around you trying to avoid harsh treatment, both they and you yourself would put more effort into the work that would be given, even if only to avoid the punishment for slaking. The masters liked it this way, and no one had the strength to resist it. And, of course, people dealt with the stress in their own neurotic ways. Some began to worship their new masters. Some became serial killers. Some decided that the flesh of their fellow slaves was much more delicious than the rations that they were given. Everyone had their own issues, and this further divided them, making the number of reports skyrocket. Whatever gods had been worshipped by those who were slaves before they came here were quickly abandoned. No god of that place would save them, and so the madness grew deeper and darker, with new, more sinister deities being invented to help the slaves deal with that which they were forced to endure. More meat came in almost every month like clockwork, and most got used to abusing them until they learned the ways of this horrid realm. None could leave once they arrived, and, despite the ramblings of those who believed themselves touched by divinity, no one and nothing would help you avoid the torment that this hell hefted upon you. There was only one way out, and no one wanted it, because death was an impossibility. There was only a death of a different kind that could be seen as a way out. Rarely, very rarely, someone would be pulled aside and turned into one of the monstrous masters in a gruesome and horrific procedure. While it was an escape, none, not even the insane, were mad enough to see it as a preferable alternative to death or continued suffering. They called it a reward for hard work and dutiful behavior, but no one saw it as such. If you worked hard enough, they would turn you into one of their own. But if you didn't work hard enough, they would punish you. It was a catch-22 of the worst kind, where you were damned if you did and damned if you didn't. And the days, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries all blended together, for time meant nothing here in this hell beyond hell. All that awaited those that came here was suffering and humiliation. Either that, or a cursed fate as a being that was even more insane than the person they once were. There was no hope in the Elder Realm, and the bonds and power of friendship had no chance of surviving there, and the masters liked it that way. What the Vale yelled as everything around where he was fell away and he found himself tumbling end over end through a reality fit more for a bad acid trip than anything else. He was flung about in this wacky realm, going this way and that with seemingly no rhyme or reason behind the sensations he was feeling. Eventually, though, this nasty time passed, as all things inevitably do. Vale was flung towards a kaleidoscope of geometric symbols and rapidly shifting colors that would easily be enough to trigger an epileptic seizure before a hole appeared in his path and he found himself tossed out onto the surface of good old terra firma. He honestly expected that he would have hit the ground with a bit more force than he had, as he had landed in such a way that was more akin to having one's shirt collar and the seat of one's pants grabbed and used as handles for throwing one out a door. As if he had been merely kicked out of a bar in an old cartoon, he landed with his back and legs forming a triangle as his face and chin, along with the upper part of his arms and the front part of his lower legs, slowed his slide across the surface to a standstill in moments. He blinked a few times as he processed exactly what had happened before slowly standing up and dusting himself off. "Well," he said as he patted a bit of dirt off of his clothes, "that was something." He looked back the way he had come, but as he suspected would be the case, the hole leading to that bad acid trip of a gateway realm was gone, as if it never had existed in the first place. With his method getting back from whence he had come gone, he turned his attention to more pressing matters, of which included finding out where the hell he was. He took a few moments to study the lay of the land and reviewed the obvious signs of something being relatively nearby aloud as a way to further drive those features into his mind. This was a useful strategy, as the mind does tend to forget things rather easily and can fail to make meaningful connections in times of stress when no verbal cues are used beforehand and during that time of stress to anchor certain facts into a person's memory. Tribal totems made of scrap materials and dangling scaled leather. A broken bar. No, not merely scaled leather, that is shed skin. A broken bar. Next up we have some rather pathetic traps that only a total noob would fall for, along with a few letters and other symbols in the draconic language. A broken bar. Finally, over there, Vale said as he focused his attention in one direction while not looking that way, are a few kobolds that can't decide what to do with the person who they have in their sights. Vale reached into his inventory and pulled out something he was initially surprised that he still had. Against higher-leveled foes, it would be utterly useless, but given that the kobolds around him were in the high teens in terms of levels, he didn't feel like he needed to worry about this not working. A small grey ball fit neatly into Vale's hand, and with a simple swing of that hand towards the ground, the ball flew and hit said ground and produced an obscuring cloud of smoke and dust. While it did make that area a target, it also applied a low-leveled stealth buff to the person who used it, and as such Vale was, to the kobolds, at least, utterly invisible even after he stepped out of the small, grey cloud that was fading rather quickly. While he could have certainly initiated first contact and likely started some series of events that would no doubt have led to some influential and possibly powerful female kobold trying to woo him, Vale was fed up with that whole song and dance. Rather than stick around or spook the little guys, he chose to make tracks and see if he could find somewhere, anywhere, that he would be able to stay for a time without running into a person who wanted him in their bed. And no, that did not just include the female gender, either. He was straighter than most would have believed. But despite that, he was damn sure that eventually some guy would try and either make him their top or, possibly, force him to be their bottom. And, while he certainly appreciated that some would have that sentiment, he wasn't interested in any of that, either from girls, boys, or all the other incalculable numbers of possible and impossible gender and sexual preference combinations. Besides, he already had enough crazy people wanting his meat to deal with. He really didn't need any more. A broken bar. HMPH. A deep rumbling flooded an ancient carved-out cavern with a deafening sound that billowed out and erupted forth from the depths like a pressure wave from a multi-ton thermobaric bomb. The living creatures nearby and even those for at least a few miles down the numerous wide and tall tunnels all popped as if they were overfilled water balloons as the grumble washed over them. Its sheer pressure doing to their bodies what happens to a person's ears as they climb towards the sky in an airplane, but to a much more potent and violent degree. Obscured from sight despite issuing that huff, a pair of massive reptilian lips curled upwards at their edges to eventually reveal teeth large enough to dwarf 3 or even 4 fully grown humans standing on each other's shoulders. This smile would have allowed the incalculable pieces of gold, silver, and other treasures piled around its bearer's body to pour in and touch the massive entity's teeth, but the lips had done more than merely keep those teeth from touching the mountain of treasure that their owner had been resting under. A force unlike any that had been seen in ages rushed out of the smiling reptilian mouth and through the teeth now that there were no lips in the way, and rather than merely melting the treasures before them they instead almost atomized them and the treasures that were beyond them as well. Another deep grumble, this time one of annoyance, issued from the colossal dragon as he forcibly sealed his mouth again. He was about to meet someone very important, after all, and he would need to remember how to exert more discipline over his own body to avoid reducing that person to a pile of gore at best or mere scattered dust at worst. Also, it would pay to learn that again for other reasons, as well. He had just atomized around just under a billionth of this horde, after all, and reduced much more than that to melted metal. Lord Vale may be durable, sure, but something told him that he would not be too happy with being set on fire merely due to being close together. As for the atomized and generally destroyed treasure, well, this horde still had a metric fuckton of stuff left in it. His destructive grunt and smile had only taken that number out of this little bastion of his wealth. This place wasn't the only place where he stored vast quantities of his personal possessions, and as he was who and what he was, all of his kin's possessions belonged to him as well, along with those other owners themselves. Still, though, he had made a dent in his blanket, and it was high time he actually leave this place and make a few rounds. It had been an age since he did that, and now that Lord Vale was here, what kind of asshole would he be if he wasn't the first of his people to meet him? Those little ones should have considered themselves especially lucky, he thought as the vast quantities of gold and other things were pushed aside as he rose from his ages-old rest. Had they been the first to actually contact Lord Vale, he would have had to wipe their entire species from existence and start their kind all over again, and that would be a pain in the ass for him, his kin, and the hypothetically doomed species that was the current iteration of the kobolds as well. In a different part of the area, a person awoke from a restful sleep. He stretched and went through his usual morning routine before donning his clothes and his armor and running down the dirt road leading from his home to a place far into the forbidden lands that no one dared enter. He didn't care for such rules, as they were meant to be broken. He was the hero, after all, and he was destined to save the world from the tyranny of the dragons and their kind. But, more than that, right now he had to meet someone he cared very deeply for, and he was sure cared very deeply for him. As he ran, countless other girls called out to him, asking him all manner of questions. He was glad that he had so many friends. "Axis, please stop by my house later on. I'll show you how nice I can be." He could never wrap his head around some of them, though for some reason, they seemed to like showing off their bodies to him, but he couldn't understand why they did. They were all friends, after all, so why would they feel the need to show him something like that? "Axis soy, I'll let you have a bite of my pie later on. So ignore the rest of those hussies and come by the inn later on." Oh, he liked pie. However, whenever he went to the inn as she suggested, there was never any pie. That made him sad. Heedless to the countless other attempts to catcall him or offer their hands in matrimony, Axis Woad, the hero, ran towards the dark forest, on his own personal quest to meet his girlfriend. "A broken bar." "Axis, you've come," said a woman who was dressed in regal finery. "Yes, Monisa, I have." "What was that big thing you needed to tell me about?" She looked him up and down and could tell that the number of brain cells operating in that simian brain of his were only about 5, maybe 6 at most. She had never appeared before him dressed like this, so of course he should be suspicious, but he wasn't. In fact, his mind did not even seem to register the fact that there were numerous draconid beings around her, waiting on her, hand and foot. She had to give herself credit, as this was her densest creation yet. A perfectly generic, denser than adamantite plaything that believed itself to be a divinely chosen hero. She smiled, not in happiness that this utter simpleton was concerned about her, but out of malicious and cruel joy that this toy was doing exactly what she wanted. She had been forced to abort several times beforehand, as the other heroes had not played by her rules. But why cry over spilled milk, or in this case, erased carbon copy civilizations? Can't you figure it out, a hero? She asked sarcastically as she kicked the face of a kobold that dared to look up at her. Is it not obvious? There was a pause that lasted a good few minutes as the 8 chosen heroes stared blankly ahead, the hamster wheel in his head spinning as the few mental faculties beyond the most basic generic hero bullshit tried desperately to be creative. Alas, it seemed as though she would have to fill in the blank head of this utter moron herself, just as she had always done. She sighed audibly with a tone and motion that showed her utter disgust for the situation and the people involved, but the dopey little human seemed to take this as a sign that he needed to say something. I don't know. I can only assume it is bad. I can help. I'm the hero. She narrowed her eyes and then rolled them. Sure you are. She wanted her toy to be controllable, but this was getting painful. She had half a mind to simply wipe the slate clean again and start over one more time. Yep, I am. Vale, damn it, he was so stupid. Could he not pick up even the most basic of context clues? Just what kind of toy had she actually created? I have to inform you that I am being taken to the lair of Monarchia the Dragon Lord, she said as she filed her nail and looked away. We won't see each other again until the final battle to decide your fate. Now, if you would, go on your dumb little quest and gather the sacred bullshit relics that can grant you an attempt at fighting the Dragon Lord. Until then, with that, she got up from her seat and walked away, leaving the hero to stand there motionless as the cogs in his dumb little head began to turn ever so slowly. If he acted now, he might be able to grab her. But she had made this hero a bit too dependent on outside influence, as he began to spout moronic and utterly generic lines about a justice and a freedom and a hope and a heroism even as she literally was just walking away. Eventually, though, the programming in his tiny little brain began to work its magic, and he turned around and ran off back the way he had come. My lady, may I speak my mind freely and without risk of destruction? Asked a colossal, black-scaled dragon that had been standing in plain sight even as the hero spoke with his master's air. I already have a good idea of what you want to say, but I shall permit it," said Monasa, or rather, Monarchia the Dragon Lord, as she shed her human disguise and took flight from the depths of the forest, scaring the ever-loving shit out of everyone nearby except for the dumb-as-dirt hero, who did not even notice. "That one is dumb. And I mean, really, really dumb. So dumb in fact that calling him dumb is a massive disservice to other dumb people. But, to be fair, there are few words that can express how utterly, totally, tremendously dumb that human is." "Your point, Anaxa?" asked the dragon with scales like diamonds that made the other dragons around it look like a bunch of chihuahuas alongside a Tibetan mastiff. "My point is," said the black dragon, "that you did an amazing job." "Really?" asked the flying colossus. "Are you attempting to flatter me?" "Yes, and also no," said the black dragon. "I'm just honestly impressed and think that this round of a hero versus dragons will be a bit more broken bar interesting. I suppose that's the right word." I could tell that fool was well made, and he will, unlike a few others, more than likely follow his inbuilt directive far more faithfully than the others. So long as nothing unexpected happens, everything should proceed more or less as expected. And this time we'll have an entire basin full of people to kill, maim, burn, and slash or turn into treasure. Does Lord Vale's arrival in my further and eyes domain count as something unexpected? Asked the diamond behemoth. Well, that would certainly change things, but why do you ask? Because, said Monarchia as a grin formed on her reptilian face. Further has risen, and he's on his way to meet Lord Vale right now. And I think he'd like to meet me as well.